Chapter 15 of the Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Measuring Character. What would you say to our going into business? It was Mrs. Spafford who asked the question, with as composed an air as though she was saying the most commonplace thing imaginable. No wonder the girls stared. "Going into business?" repeated Addie Stowell at last. "Why, Mrs. Spafford, what can you mean?" "I believe it is feasible," their hostess said, thoughtfully. "I think it probable that each of us can do some special thing very well by which we could earn money. What is there to hinder our uniting our forces and earning it? How is it, Miss Addie? Can't you at this moment think of a branch of industry which could be made a fair exchange for dollars and cents?" "Why, yes," said Addie, hesitating a moment. Then smiling, "I know how to crochet almost anything, if people were willing to buy it after it is done." "Very well. Suppose now, for the curiosity of the thing, we learn if there is not a branch of work for each of us. I, for instance, can do plain sewing, perhaps a little that is not so very plain if I choose. Who embroiders, and who braids, and who hemstitches?" The subject proved to be one which unsealed all lips, and the girls found, greatly to their amusement, that not one present but asserted her individuality by promptly selecting something from the great field of fancy work that she liked to do. In fact, would rather do a little of than not. "But then," declared Addie, "I don't know what good it will do us. Who wants to buy such things? They only do it for the sake of benevolence, and we have to coax and coax until I'm just ashamed. Besides, Mrs. Spafford, I thought you didn't believe in it at all." "What, in going into business? Oh, yes, I do. I am a firm believer in money making. Legitimate business of any sort I have a great respect for. I don't propose a fair, you understand, with an evening of eager, exciting work, with spirits wrought up to fever heat, to be followed by days and sometimes weeks of reaction, when all the ordinary work of life becomes vapid. This that I propose is an entirely different matter." Still the girls looked from one to another, and then back to her, and were evidently greatly bewildered. "It is a conundrum," laughed Addie, at last, "and I don't believe we can any of us guess it. If we all give it up, will you tell us the answer?" "It is just as simple," declared their hostess, smiling, "as that 2 and 2 make 4. I am proposing a partnership business, based from the very first on strictly business rules and regulations, without an atom of benevolence about it. Why isn't it an entirely reasonable thing? Suppose, for illustration, that we had a room in the central part of the town, suited to our needs, and there we opened well, until we find a better name, we will call it a fancy store, though I do hope we should develop a taste for strictly useful articles as well as fancy ones. Now, what if each of us was willing to advance, not contribute, you understand, but advance 50 cents each as a capital. With this capital we purchase each some material and manufacture 1, 2, or 3 articles for sale. When all is ready, we open our store, say for 2 hours on Saturday afternoons, one of our number serving as clerk for the first Saturday, another taking her place on the Saturday following, we meantime promising that the store shall be kept supplied with the article or articles which we have promised to make, provided its returns justify the purchasing of more material. We ask no one to buy for the sake of benevolence. We put no extravagant prices on anything in the name of benevolence. We conduct our business in all respects as our fathers and brothers do, dividing the income each month amongst the stockholders, and pledging ourselves to use 1/10 of it in benevolence. If it shall amount to 10 cents a month for each of us, our way will be clear to organize a young ladies' band." Then what a tumult there was in that little parlor! They all talked at once, and laughed and exclaimed, and stormed the inventor of this strange scheme with questions. She had need of all her wits. "But, Mrs. Spafford, how could we plan so as to supply the demand? Suppose we had but one pincushion, for instance, and every mortal woman who appeared on some Saturday afternoon should insist on having a pincushion. Women are just so perverse." "Then we would have our secretary notify the members that all the pincushion force were desired to put their brains and fingers to work, and make pincushions in view of the next Saturday's onset." "Where would we get our material?" "We would need a buying committee, or rather a buying partner. That is quite common in all large firms, some one or two whose duty it would be to purchase material, write orders to be sent in as to what was needed, and the money for the purchases calculated beforehand, and drawn from the funds held by paying clerk." "Suppose she hadn't money enough for the purchases?" "Then we should manifestly have to do without the material until such time as we could afford to enlarge our business." "Couldn't we buy on credit?" Both Mrs. Spafford and Addie Stowell shook their heads emphatically at this, and Addie said, "No, ma'am! You don't catch me launching out in any enterprise that hasn't a solid cash foundation. I should expect my father to disown me forthwith. If there is anything he hates, it is the credit system." "What if we become bankrupt?" "There is no danger of it," Mrs. Spafford answered promptly. "A business done on cash principles has no occasion for bankruptcy." "Well," said Marion Wells, when the babel of tongues was somewhat subsiding, "it is a novel idea, certainly, and it is a great deal more fun than a fair. But, after all, I can't see what special difference there is in the right or wrong of the matter. I think fairs are all right, but if I didn't, I fail to see why I shouldn't condemn this also." "Why, you don't think stores are wrong, do you?" This question, in various forms, was leveled at her by several of the girls at once, Mrs. Spafford sitting back a silent listener, and enjoying this sharpening of their wits. "Oh, well," Marion said, "of course it was nice to use such phrases, but also of course it wouldn't be a real store, nor conducted on any such principles. It would just be a fair or bazaar or something of that kind with a different name." This made Mrs. Spafford sit erect and speak decidedly. "Not if you follow out my plan, girls. I warn you beforehand that I mean nothing but business. I think very likely that real fun, as you call it, can be gotten out of the idea, but it is not to have that for a foundation. I have been proposing a strictly business transaction, and if you vote to adopt my suggestion, it must be with the understanding that every member of the firm is held rigidly to business rules and regulations from the very outset. In fact, I hope one outcome from the enterprise, if you take it up, will be a discovery, if any of you need to make a discovery, that young ladies can be as thoroughly businesslike and methodical in their work as men. We expect to do what is strictly woman's work, it is true, and to do it in womanly ways, but those ways should never for a moment be allowed to become a synonym for looseness or inaccuracies. Now, as to the question concerning the essential difference between such an enterprise and what is known as a church fair. One of my objections to the latter way of working is the fact that there is no legitimate place for any such work. The church, even its chapel or parlor or lecture room, by whatever name you call its smaller rooms, is not, and according to my idea, should never become a place of merchandise. Buying and selling may be very legitimate transactions, but we don't want to see them carried on in a church. Even when we hire a hall for the purpose, it is not actually suited for such a purpose, and the large amount that is likely to be charged for it detracts so much from the possible profits that it of itself begets in us a feverish desire to make up that leak by enormous profits, or questionable side traps, like post offices and lemonade wells, even if we do not descend to the actual coarseness of ring cakes or grab bags. This plain speaking produced a sensation. The girls bestowed speaking glances on each other. Convenient elbows were nudged, and one or two quite loud ahems indicated that some portion of the audience considered another portion of it touched on sensitive points. None of these little asides did Mrs. Spafford pause to notice, but hastened to add, "Then another and very important drawback is the fact that preparing for a fair always brings a period of feverish haste and excitement. The eventful evening about which so much talk has been made, and of which so much is expected, is chosen and announced, and draws near, and the gay young workers wake up at the 11th hour to discover that they are not nearly ready for it. Then come late hours, and neglect of books and study, and duty of almost every sort, and the girls run hither and thither distractedly, unable to think of anything but the approaching crisis. Finally it comes, and the last day before the final crush is often filled up with heart-burnings caused by mistakes made or quick words spoken under the impulse of haste and strong excitement. Haven't you admitted here this afternoon that such is nearly always the case? Besides, I wonder if any of you can have forgotten the distressing reaction of the next morning, when only a very few of you rise to the degree of self-abnegation necessary to helping royally in the clearing up. The rest stay at home and are miserable, because their consciences hint that they ought to be helping, and those doing the work are miserable because they are tempted to say sharp, uncharitable things about the people who are not helping. And for days thereafter there seems to be very little in life worth doing, while, at the same time, nothing looks so improbable as that they will ever want to go through the trials of another fair. Now all this is unnatural and unhealthy. In business life it is very different. There is a regular routine, which never, or at least need never, rise to an absorbing height, to be followed by days of reaction. Besides, there is no temptation to lose all delicacy of feeling and sense of propriety, and make oneself a nuisance by tormenting people to buy what they do not want because it is for the church. As if the church were a beggar and must be supported by public charity!" Mrs. Spafford's cheeks glowed. She was very sensitive where the honor of the church was concerned. As she looked at the matter, it had been made, by those who should have guarded its reputation carefully, to wear the guise of a pauper long enough. Some of the girls laughed. They thought their leader peculiar. They were incapable of taking such high ground. Why should they not be? Their mothers before them had not taken it, had not so educated them. But there were 2 or 3 whose thoughtful faces and earnest eyes helped Mrs. Spafford wonderfully. She could plainly see there was material here for growth. If only 2 or 3, and those leaders, could be educated, even at this late day, to take such a stand as she was sure ought to be taken on all these questions, the generation to come would see a reform. But whether most of the girls saw the principle at stake or not, they saw the novelty, and were interested and excited over the scheme. To go into business, to make money, to be partners, and have a buying committee and a money drawer, and a scheme unlike anything else that had ever been tried, was something that they could understand and appreciate. With but one exception, they voted unanimously in favor of the scheme. Miss Lily Archer was sure it would not meet with Mamma's approval. "Mamma has peculiar ideas," she said, looking down with sweet shyness and toying with her fan. "I beg your pardon for saying so, but I am sure she will think it unladylike." Poor little Lily Archer! Mrs. Spafford had herself seen her personating Rebecca at the well, dressed in a startlingly picturesque costume, dipping up lemonade for certain fast young men, who laughed and talked too freely with the Jewish maiden to represent either ancient history or modern propriety, according to the views of some. But the fair Lily, as unlike the Jewish type of features and color, by the way, as her mimic lemonade well was unlike the spot where Rebecca watered the sheep, had never been taught that style of propriety. Also, she had seen her in a tableau, personating a richly dressed and richly jeweled dishonorable wife, receiving a tender caress from a man who was not, even in the tableau, her husband. And neither she nor her mother had considered this unladylike. What could be expected from such? Nevertheless, Miss Lily did not positively withdraw. She said she would think about it, would talk with mamma. It was all so very new and queer. Nothing like it had ever been done "in our set, you know." Oh, she would help, make pretty things, and buy them very likely, and of course she would give the 50 cents. Why did they have such a ridiculously small sum to start with? Oh, as to giving, and all that sort of thing, of course she would help, but she couldn't put her name down as one committed to sustain the enterprise, at least not now. And just here Mrs. Spafford interposed. No, they would not take her money. If she were not ready to join heart and hand in the work, they would have none of her. It was right that she should consult her mother, of course. They were all to do that. Nothing was to be definite this afternoon, except plans to be submitted to the heads at home. The only question to be settled was, do you agree heartily, uncompromisingly, to all this, if mother and father do? Still, Miss Lily's name would not go down, and Mrs. Spafford had discovered what she surmised and wanted to know, that "mamma" was put in, as a graceful way of saying that the idea looked dull and commonplace, and lacking in gentility to the fair Lily. Occasionally there is a curious offshoot from the parent tree, as unlike what might be expected as possible. Just such an unexpected character did Lena Bacon suddenly develop. She shook back her gay brown curls, and flashed her bright eyes, and declared that she thought it was "just fun." 10 times nicer than any fair she had ever heard of, and she was going into it with all her heart, and could paint Christmas cards in a perfectly lovely way, everybody knew, and they'd see what she could do. "What shall we do for a store?" queried one, and the question brought a sudden lull, and all eyes looked inquiringly at Mrs. Spafford, as though she were then and there expected to produce a store ready for occupancy. "We need a room in somebody's house," she said promptly, "a good-sized, convenient room that some person, who has more house room than she needs, will rent to us on reasonable terms. Oh, yes, indeed, we must pay rent. This is not benevolence, remember, it is business. Who of us wishes to beg a house to live in rent-free? Where shall we find the person to appeal to who has unnecessary house room?" Immediately all eyes were leveled at Addie Stowell. She lived with her father, mother, and young brother in the old family mansion which had been almost in the country in the days long ago, before the city moved up so far. The family had been old, aristocratic, and wealthy. The wealth had departed, but age and aristocracy were left. Still, it was no sham aristocracy. The family had no more idea of trying to profess themselves rich, now that they were poor, than they had thought of professing poverty in the days of their wealth. But a store in the old Stowell homestead! That was a leap somewhere, surely. And yet the house was so large, and so roomy, and so quaint, and so exactly what would delight every girl among them. Addie laughed. "You all look at me as though I owned a first-class store in my own right," she said gaily. "I know what you are every one thinking of. You see yourselves at this minute selling tape and thread and pins in our big old shut-up parlor. Ought we not to have a thread and needle and so forth department, Mrs. Spafford? It is a perfect nuisance to have to take a car downtown for everything of that sort that is wanted. I know plenty of people who think so. Well, I'll ask mother and father. That's the best I can do. We have thought of most everything to help along, but we never thought of renting the parlor for a store before. Now that's the truth. But why not? Mother'll be willing, I think. I don't know about father. Why, Lafayette was entertained in that house, you know, and General Washington himself. It ought to be dedicated to liberty and the pursuit of happiness, then, oughtn't it? Sure enough. Well, I'll see what I can do. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Last Night Measured by Daylight. It was all fairyland to Jenny West. The evening was so lovely, the carriage so luxurious, the accessories all so perfect. She was conscious of looking remarkably well, and Will was so handsome. Then, too, as they rolled smoothly down Beckman Avenue, some of the very girls that she would have preferred above all others to have seen her under those circumstances, walked slowly by, casting admiring, not to say envious, glances at the occupants of the carriage. Will was in a specially genial mood, for he was a young man given to fluctuations in his moods, even when with Jenny West. Sometimes he was so nearly silent as to be almost moody, and his heart would be evidently busy with perplexing thoughts, but on this evening he chatted gaily, yet with a gentleness in the gaiety and a careful attention to his companion's comfort, such as made her heart throb with gratified something, who shall say whether it was love or pride? The subjects for conversation were numerous, and sufficiently interesting, so that Jenny, while she thought of that important matter about which you will remember she intended to talk with him that very evening, she told herself it wasn't a suitable opportunity just now, she would wait a little, and as they neared the whirl of the city, she said, still to her inner self, "When we are coming home will be just the time for a grave subject like that. There are too many people looking at us now, and it is too light and bustling, it is almost like being in society. When it is dark and quiet all around will be a much more suitable time for earnest talk. Will is so full of life now, I presume he will have calmed down by that time." So she dismissed the prayer meeting as a topic for conversation, and gave herself up to pleasure. As for the opera, it was all that operas generally are, and perhaps more than some. The simple truth is that this young lady and gentleman, in purity of sentiment, were above the play to which they were listening. The style of dressing presented was such as covered Jenny's face with blushes, and made her attendant wish several times that he had not been such a fool as to bring her. The main reason that either of them endured in quiet that which offended their sense of propriety was because the house was well filled with fashionable people, whose position in society Jenny at least thought was such as to warrant one in being pleased with whatever pleased them. So, though she blushed, she also laughed. Moreover, there was, of course, a great deal to enjoy. The carefully studied scenery, the witching music, the exquisite play of light and shade, the exquisite toilets, all combined to fascinate a wiser head than Jenny, at her best, possessed. The fact that a great deal of the singing was in an unknown tongue was a greater source for thankfulness than at least these two realized. However much she might have desired to admire, because it was a fashionable opera, and the fashionable world admired it, I feel sure that could poor Jenny have understood the meaning of some of those sentences, she would have blushed not only, but would have withdrawn herself from that indecent presence. Whatever may have been said of the larger portion of the audience, I am glad to be able to tell you that Will and Jenny could not translate, and never had heard translated, much that they listened to that evening. This being the case, what was there about it all that seemed such an intoxication? Is there something peculiarly sensuous in music? Jenny found herself yielding more and more to the spell which she did not understand. Had she been familiar with the Lotus Eaters, She might have quoted from their story to describe her sensations. Life, real, actual daylight life, seemed horrible to her, something to shrink from, dread. To sit forever surrounded by all the soft and tender and exquisite sights and sounds, the dreamy lull of music floating around her, Will Coleman slowly swaying her elegant fan to and fro in exquisite time with the music, this was life, happiness, heaven. Nothing else was worth a thought. Did she put all this nonsense into words? Not at all. She was not even conscious, save in a dim way, that she thought it. She did not know that her mental faculties were actually intoxicated. Well, it ended at last, as even such hours of bliss will end, and they passed out into the darkness. Only for a moment. They made their speedy way to a refreshment room, and Jenny daintily tasted an ice, while Will drank before her eyes a glass of wine. It was something that he rarely did before her, something that he knew she, in a sort of fashion, disapproved. Yet tonight he was excited, and felt that he needed it to steady his nerves. Besides, was her disapproval so very great? She only shook her head at him and said, "Oh, Will, I am ashamed of you." But she smiled, and looked so pretty while she said it, that he felt provoked to tempt her to say it again. "She is as pretty as a witch tonight," he muttered, as he drained the last drop. "I wish I could take her to the theatre, or to the opera, or somewhere, every night of her life, and there were no days between to think about. I wish I had a fortune. Hang it all, I wonder if I dare take another glass." It was more fortunate for Jenny than she knew that he decided another glass unsafe. His was not the sort of brain that could bear even one glass steadily, and he hurried her somewhat abruptly away from her ice and into the carriage. In a few moments they left the brilliantly lighted streets, and were alone and quiet. No society now, nothing to prevent that earnest talk which Jenny was to have had with her friend that evening. The soft, balmy air hovered around them, and the holy stars looked down on them, and every influence of nature was calming and ennobling. What was the trouble with Jenny? Every nerve was in an intense and unnatural quiver. She had by no means calmed into her ordinary self. Life was an intoxication still, not a grave, day-by-day reality. She didn't think of the days at all. Only the witching, star-lighted nights, and soft cushions, and careful hands to draw her wrappings about her. She hummed a bar from the most dreamy strain that the opera contained, and said, "Wasn't it perfectly lovely, Will?" "Did you like it?" he asked her, and he looked down on her, and she looked beautiful to him. Neither did his voice have its usual poise. He had the added excitement of a glass of wine to combat. "Like it?" she said ecstatically. "It was heaven." The comparison did not jar her, neither was it said with the intention of being irreverent. Her senses were aglow. "Do you think, during that 4 miles drive, she said anything to him about the prayer meeting, or about joining the church, and leading in prayer, and taking his position as a responsible and prominent member?" The church! She forgot its existence. What had the church in common with this entrancing, star-lighted night, with the weird strains of the opera still sounding in their ears? Just now, would she have cared to hear his voice in prayer? What mattered whether he was ever an officer of the church? I do not wish you to understand that any of these thoughts presented themselves for her to settle, for they were simply so utterly unimportant that she forgot them all. "Jenny," her companion said, looking down on her as she curled in a graceful little ball among the cushions, "don't you wish we were 1,000,000 miles from home, and it was going to take us forever to get there?" Ah me! As they count distances, who understand the relative importance of things, how many million miles were those 2 from home? God grant that it may not take them forever to reach there. This was a speech that Will Coleman, in his cooler moments, would think silly, would sneer over. It is a pity for a man to make remarks to a woman that even he himself will have to sneer over when he remembers them afterward. But Jennie was in no mood to help him. "Yes," she said, with a delicious sense of dreaminess to her voice, "I wish nothing was anywhere." What did that mean? Not even Jennie knew, and if she didn't, who should? The young man kept looking at her. He hesitated a little, he struggled dimly with his judgment, but it was such a witching night, and she was so pretty, well, he was in no mood to struggle. Why should he? Why should anybody do anything save exactly what he wants to do? "Jennie," he said, and he bent his head lower, and drew her wrapping more closely around her, and herself more closely to him. "Dear Jennie." Do you think I am going to tell you what was said? Even over such a miserable little caricature of love as this, for the sake of the high and holy feeling which it imitates, I would draw the veil of silence. You can imagine what was said, the impassioned words that were spoken, the solemn promises that were made. What a solemn pity it is that neither of those young things, for so far as regarded their knowledge of life and its responsibilities and solemnities, both were young, what a pity that they should play with promises so sacred, nor realize that the eternal God, looking down upon them, heard their vows, and recorded them for their eyes to meet again after this living is over. It was not until hours afterward that Jennie, all her pretty things thrown wildly around Mrs. Evans's guest chamber, as she overturned a pile of laces to find a stray brush, was reminded by a glimpse of her Bible that she had designed this evening's conversation in a different channel. "I declare," she said aloud, pausing in her search, "I never said a single word to Will about joining the church or anything. I forgot every breath about it. Oh, well, how could I be expected to know what strange things he would have to say to me?" And she blushed and laughed to herself in the light of the tardy moon that was just flooding the eastern sky. Then the soliloquy went on. "I shall have opportunity enough hereafter to say what I choose, and he will be bound to heed what I say besides. I wonder if we shall go to many operas together. Will said the music was well enough, but oh dear, what nonsense he talked tonight! I wonder if he meant half of it." There was a happy light in her eyes. She fully believed just then that he meant much more than half of it. But it was thus that she dismissed the subject of the church and Will's proposed prominent part in it. No, I mistake. It was not dismissed yet. Her thoughts reverted to it the moment she knelt to pray. If ever Jennie West was to pray for her friend, you would think it might be on the night when she had promised to be his forever. But she found, I cannot say to her dismay, that it was even harder than usual to hold her thoughts. They would flutter around that eventful evening, and live over again its scenes. If her thoughts, while she knelt there in the attitude of prayer, could have been photographed before her, I fancy they might have startled her a little. They ran somewhat after this manner. "Our Father, who art in heaven." I really don't know whether I care to have Will join the church after all. People can be good without that. He is real good, I am sure. If I ever do half as well as he has done, I shall be content. "Hallowed be thy name." Some people have such overstrained ideas about a public profession. Callie would think he ought never to go inside of an opera after that. I wonder what Callie will say to the news I have to give her. As if there could be any harm in operas. I'm sure the music was heavenly, and the whole scene, the lights and flowers, and the colors and everything, was unlike earth enough to make one think of heaven. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven." Will is such a perfect gentleman. It is a pleasure to have him even pick up one's handkerchief, he does it so gracefully. I wish Callie and her husband hadn't so many notions. I fairly dread to tell her about it. She will have a lecture for us both. I don't want to be as good as Callie is, now that's a fact. She is too good for this earth. She ought to wait until she goes to heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. If he only had money he would be just perfect. What a shame it is that his old aunt didn't leave her property to him. I hate the sight of that prinking, red-haired niece that got it all. She thought she would get Will by the means. I'll show her that she missed her calculation in that respect. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Will shall take me to the theater occasionally, anyhow. I've never been to the plays that I want most to hear. For thine is the kingdom. Do you imagine she realized the two trains of thought which she was carrying on? I don't think she did. The form of the prayer was so familiar to her that she did not need to hold her thoughts to the words, and she was so used to letting them flutter off in that wild fashion on whatever chanced to occur next, that she did not feel the startling incongruity. At the close of the formula she did draw her thoughts away long enough to put up one sincere, if selfish, petition. "Oh, Lord, please take care of my dear Will. I wonder if he has gotten home yet." This last sentence not included in the prayer, but insisting on presenting itself in the same breath to be thought about. As for Will Coleman, he dismissed the carriage at the corner, feeling the need of a walk in the cool, quiet air to calm his blood after all the excitements of the evening. What he thought he kept entirely to himself, not even expressing it by a whistle. He let himself into his boarding-house in a very quiet fashion, quietly made his way upstairs, lighted his lamp, and saw first that Bible lying open exactly where he had left it several days before, lying on his bookshelf where he had lain it, proof positive of the amount of daily care his room received, and of the amount of Bible reading that he had since done. He seized it now, closed it roughly, without a glance at the fly-leaf, and tossed it to the topmost shelf without a word. The next morning there was no moonlight, no starlight, no music, only for the young man a sense of exhaustion following the late hours and intense excitement of the night before, and the dull headache which always followed a glass of wine. "Hey-ho," he said with a weary yawn. "I've got to get through another day at that confounded store, selling potatoes and onions and cabbage and cheese. I wish the world was made of rose-leaves, and we dined off nectar and ambrosia. $800 a year, and house rent and cabbage and what not, to say nothing of opera tickets and carriage hire and kid gloves. 6 buttons on them, too, I counted last night. I wonder that didn't steady my nerves. What a confounded simpleton I was! The idea of my acting like a youth with 10,000 a year! Still, I don't know how a fellow was going to help it. The music and the witchery generally got hold of me, and she is as pretty as a doll. If it weren't for money it would be all right. Some people succeed in making money in this world, but they don't do it selling onions and the like for other folks to pocket the profits. I believe I must cast about for a better way." And Jenny? Well, it was morning with her, and the flowers she wore the night before had withered, and the witching curls of her hair were one irritable snarl. Also she heard Mr. and Mrs. Evans in their room talking too loud, Dane was, when the guest chamber had an occupant. "The fact is, Eva," this is what she heard him say, "the fact is, we must retrench in some way, or I must just admit that I am a dishonest man and cannot pay my bills. I have no sort of idea how I am to meet those already made, and they grow larger every day of our lives. There is mismanagement somewhere." "Pshaw!" said the lady in the guest chamber, as she jerked out a whole frizz which had tied itself up into a million cross little knots. If Will ever ventures to speak to me in any such fashion as that, he'll be sorry, I can assure him. Bills and retrenchment and embarrassment. I wonder if I am doomed to hear that story all my life. If I thought I was, I'd want to go to the next opera and have a good time, and drown myself in the river on the way home, Will and I. Isn't it a sad beginning to a union of care and trial and responsibility and pain, when the first morning afterward looks just as it did to those two? And yet they thought, poor things, that they loved each other. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of A Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. An Open Door. We must have somebody who understands business better than we do, to sort of manage us and things generally. This had been Addie Stowell's half-laughing, half-serious announcement, on the day when, the Stowell parlor having been secured, and plans in general carefully matured, the now thoroughly interested girls had met to arrange plans in detail. Addie's suggestion met with instant approval, and at least a dozen voices declared that Mrs. Spafford was just the one to take care of their heads and their money. That lady who had foreseen the necessity for some such arrangement, and believed, moreover, that it was important to select a woman rather than a girl for general manager, resolved to accept the appointment without further discussion. Very well, I will arrange to be your confidential clerk and manage the finances of the firm to the best of my ability until such time as we shall agree to have a younger and more sprightly assistant. I make one proviso to the effect that you will empower me to secure a helper where I choose, one who shall, under my direction, do whatever work which would naturally be in my province that I choose to give her. This will not relieve me from responsibility, for I will engage to be responsible for the doings of my chosen helper. This was agreed upon, and the managing clerk took the chair. From this moment the process of organizing the somewhat ponderous firm, and getting the machinery in running order, went on rapidly and satisfactorily. The truth is, the managing clerk had not lain awake for several nights without results. She knew exactly what she wanted her firm to do, and the way to set them at it. It is no part of my intention to take you through the details of this unique business. You can imagine that the task was not an easy one, and that there were constant pitfalls to avoid. It is rather with an experience which, as we see events, grew out of this plan that I have to do. Mrs. Spafford, in suggesting the importance of a sub-clerk for herself, had a plan in mind. Her heart was very much set on getting nearer to her fair and, yet so often, sad-faced neighbor, Mrs. Dane Evans, getting near enough to help her, for that she was sorely in need of help grew daily more evident. The lines on her face were deepening, and there was a pitiful pallor creeping over it that told of a weary heart struggling with some burden daily growing too heavy for her to lift. Could she be interested in this enterprise of the young ladies? Could she be prevailed upon to give them help by becoming associated with their leader, not to assume more responsibility, but to take certain duties easily performed, and perhaps much to her taste, upon herself? And then, could it be hoped that, in the many conferences which this partnership of responsibility would involve, they would get nearer to each other, so near that, in time, she would accept Mrs. Spafford as a tried friend, and let her help, if she could, in the spot where she needed special help? And then, could not this servant of her master hope to lead that tired heart closer to the great burden-bearer? Such, in brief, was the plan toward which Mrs. Spafford was quietly working. Not seeing her way clear, but seeing a little entering place, perhaps, she resolved to push in that direction, while she watched for more light. It was over this entire matter that she studied and frequently prayed while she went about her home one afternoon. Not a word had been said to Mrs. Evans as yet. The managing clerk had been watching her opportunity. So much depended on one's first impressions of things. Having prayed much over the whole scheme, she found herself looking often from the window, watching the clouds, for the day was dull and rainy. "I don't know why it should seem so important to go over there on this day of all others," she said to herself. "It is raining, and is not a day when one would be likely to expect a call unless the business were urgent. Mine certainly can wait several days if necessary, and yet I feel impelled to go this afternoon." She made all necessary arrangements for the evening meal, which she and Warren looked forward always to enjoying together, and settled herself at the window with her sewing. There was no use in thinking about going out while the rain came down so steadily, and the wind was blowing too. A thoroughly disagreeable day. It was easy to settle oneself outwardly, yet she found that she had not gotten away from the impression that now was the time. She sewed steadily for a few minutes, then rolled up her work with a resolute air. "I will go now," she said decidedly. "Why shouldn't I? I am not afraid of the rain, and she may be very lonely. I cannot get away from the feeling that this may be my opportunity." Resolved upon being as informal as possible, and have her appearance fit the day, she donned waterproof and rubbers, and, umbrella in hand, sallied forth, knocking at the little side door of the small house, instead of ringing the front door-bell. There was no response to her knock. She stood dismayed. So strong had been the impression that she was to come on just that afternoon, that to find the house apparently deserted was a keen disappointment. What, then, had the pressure meant which had seemed to her so like a voice directing her steps? "The house doesn't look closed," she said, still arguing with herself. "The curtains would be dropped if she had gone for the day. I wonder if I may venture to the kitchen door. Perhaps they cannot hear a knock at this point." So she stepped around the neat little box of a house to the kitchen door. No, it was ajar. Somebody was at home. She knocked boldly. No response, and the wind was whirling her umbrella about in an insane fashion, and the eaves were dripping on her head. It was a very disagreeable spot in which to wait, and yet somebody in this little house was at home, and the resolute caller was unwilling to beat a retreat. "I'll step in," she said boldly. "I am getting all wet standing here, and I can explain the intrusion." A moment more, and she was in the tiny kitchen. It was a scene of dreary desolation. The fire in the cooking stove was out, not decorously out, as in many a thrifty household at that hour of the day, but there was every indication that it had gone out ruthlessly, and with malice aforethought. The hearth was ash-bestrewn, a dishpan half filled with greasy water occupied the top, while certain pots, kettles, and various other cooking utensils stood around in dismay. The kitchen table, too, was a scene from which the tidy housekeeper turned quickly, appalled at herself for venturing in, and almost feeling as though Mrs. Evans could never forgive her for looking on the desolations of that kitchen. Not a person was to be seen, and the uninvited guest had just resolved to slip quietly away, and ring, perhaps, at the front door, if she could not bring herself to give up the visit, when she heard that which startled her into a change of plans. The unmistakable sound of bitter weeping came to her from the only half-closed door of the adjoining room. Not only weeping, but lamentation, a voice as of one in almost mortal agony, either of body or mind. All manner of conjectures rushed through Mrs. Spafford's mind. Mrs. Evans might be ill, might be in a sudden and terrible affliction, and was certainly alone. Could she hesitate any longer on the ground of intrusion? Certain it was that she could no more go home with the wail of that voice in her ears than she could leave any other fellow creature in distress and do nothing to help. Pausing only to set her dripping umbrella in a safe place, and close the kitchen door, She stepped quickly across the room, pushed wide the intervening door, and stood face to face with Mrs. Evans, who sprang suddenly to her feet, a look of utter astonishment, by no means unmingled with indignation, struggling with the tears on her face. "Mrs. Spafford!" It was every word she said, but a whole volume of wounded pride and resentment over this unwarrantable intrusion were pent up in the voice. Mrs. Spafford stepped quickly to her side, and laid a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear friend, I seem to you to have been guilty of a great rudeness, but indeed I mean no intrusion. I came to your kitchen door on an errand, and, finding it ajar, and no one quite ready to answer my knock, I took the liberty of stepping in a moment out of the storm, and heard your voice as if in pain or distress. I feared you were alone and needed help, and I came to offer it. I will go away at once, only believe me, I had only a heart full of love and a longing desire to help you." Before this sentence was completed, Mrs. Evans had sunk again in a little heap on the couch from which she had risen, and with the pitiful cry, "God knows I need help, if any one on earth does," burst into a perfect passion of weeping. Her visitor bent over her a distressed, doubtful face. Ought she to go away from one in such bitter mental agony as this? Yet what could she say to help or comfort her that would not seem like an attempt to pry into the secrets of another? "Dear friend," she said, and her voice was very tender, "I think you know where to look for help, no matter what your trial or burden. Whether it be great or very small, He is equally ready to have it brought to Him and left there. Why don't you ask His help? You are one of His own." "I am not, burst with passionate tears from the poor, burdened heart. "I am nothing at all but a miserable woman who has made a failure of everything that I ever undertook. I ought never to have taken the responsibilities of a wife and a housekeeper upon me. I am a failure in every sense of the word. I ought to die and go away out of the world, and give others a chance to live." What desperate talking was this from a woman who had been a beautiful and treasured bride but a short time before? What could be said to her? Was not this a matter with which a stranger ought not to intermeddle? What if it were only a childish outburst of passion over some misunderstanding between her husband and herself? An outburst, the memory of which, and of the fact that there was a human eye-witness, would humiliate her to the very dust after it was over. Again and again, even in those few moments, did Mrs. Spafford chide herself for having entered that kitchen door. Yet she could not leave her now, and thus. Besides, what if this were a genuine sorrow, a pain which did not go away after the first outburst? She remembered the drawn look on the young wife's face, and greatly feared that the burden, whatever it was, stayed with her. Also, what did that voice mean which persistently urged her toward coming over here in the rain of this very afternoon? What was there that she ought to say to this child-woman? All these thoughts passed swiftly, then she spoke again, still in that low, quieting voice. "Dear friend, whatever you are, no matter what mistakes you have made, no matter how unfit you feel, you are dear to Christ at this moment. He loves you and waits for you. He has infinite power, and infinite wisdom, and infinite forgiveness. There is nothing that He cannot forgive, and nothing that He cannot help you to do if it is right that you should do it. I speak with authority, for I have tried Him. Yes, with better authority than that, for He has said it. He shall deliver thee in 6 troubles, yea, in 7 there shall no evil touch thee. It is His own voice speaking. Go to Him for help, and as sure as the sun shines above these clouds, you will get just what you need. Never mind whether you are one of His children or not. Claim the place of a child, because you need to be, and wish to be, and mean to be one from this moment." She spoke rapidly, with a sort of eager positiveness, and yet calmness. It had the effect of quieting the bitter sobs, but she could not tell how much heed had been given to the direction. She waited in silence a moment, then spoke again. "Is there any way in which I could help you, or shall I go away and come at another time?" She received no answer at all. In great doubt as to what to do next, she stood before the drooping figure with its face buried in its hands. Just as she had resolved to slip quietly out and trust to a note in which she would pour out her heart in sympathy, Mrs. Evans raised herself to a sitting posture, brushed back the disordered hair from her swollen eyes, and said, with an effort at dignity, "I beg your pardon, madame. I have been saying some wild and foolish words to you, I am afraid. You must not think anything of them. I do not mean what I said, whatever it was. It isn't often I give way to my feelings in this manner, but, indeed, I am so miserable and so helpless." The voice, which had been growing more tremulous with each word, suddenly broke into another burst of tears, and the poor lady buried her face in her hands again. Mrs. Spafford's resolution was taken. At least she could not leave a soul in distress. Afterward she might regret the intrusion, but now that she had intruded, that part could not now be helped, she would do what she could to guide this struggling heart into the light. She sat down beside Mrs. Evans and laid a tender, caressing hand on hers. After all, that seemed the utmost limit of her power. But Mrs. Evans was trying hard to control herself. A moment more, and she sat erect again. "I hope you will forgive me," she said humbly. "I am very weak and foolish. I really am in great trouble, Mrs. Spafford, and yet it is nothing that I can explain. My life seems such a failure to me. I cannot write it, because I do not know how to begin, which way to turn. I have meant right. I meant to make the sweetest, happiest home for my husband that a man ever had, but it is not my fault, nor Dane's. Mrs. Spafford, I may as well tell you, it is the miserable money. We cannot live on our salary. We are in debt, and going deeper every day, and we see no way out. And my husband blames me. Of course he does. Why should he not? A wife ought to know how to spend the money that her husband earns in such a way as to bring him comfort and not misery. And I have not done it, and cannot do it. I have tried and made a miserable failure. It is my fault, you see, after all. To-day the whole dreadful sense of failure broke over me, and I felt that I could not bear it any longer. The troubles of this awful day have just broken down the little strength and pride that I had, and I gave way utterly. There now, I have told you the whole wretched story without intending to. I have humiliated myself to the lowest depths, and dragged my husband down with me." And the hot passionate tears rolled down her cheeks. Mrs. Spafford put a firm arm around the shrinking, trembling form of the excited woman, and spoke in quiet tones, "My dear friend, let me talk to you a moment, quietly and reasonably. You have done no very dreadful thing in saying to me, as a friend, that you find it hard to bring your expenditures within your income. That is not so strange a thing that it should seem to you a startling or even a humiliating matter. Neither is it a strange thing that you have failed. I am older than you, I think, at least in experience I am many years older, and I know just how hard a matter it is to get the whole bewildering machinery of household life into running order. I am not surprised that you should have grown utterly discouraged, and believed yourself to be making a humiliating failure. What you need is a determination not to give way to any such feeling. A resolution to meet and conquer this problem, and show your husband that you are a general equal to the emergency. It can be done. And, dear friend, I want to repeat to you what I said at the outset, that no perplexity is too commonplace to take to the Lord Jesus Christ. I know people who suppose it would be almost irreverent to take their domestic bewilderments to Christ. I cannot think what kind of a friend they imagine him to be, if they are afraid to go to him with everything. I should never have dared to assume the cares and responsibilities of our home, if I had not known that I could go to Christ for direction as to how to wisely spend the money he put into my hands, and how to order all my affairs so that there would be no friction." Mrs. Evans had dried her tears, and was looking with troubled and yet puzzled face at her guest. "That only makes me feel," she said, suddenly interrupting her, "just as a number of things you have said at other times have made me feel, that your religion and mine were so utterly different, that they could not both of them be religion. And lately I have come to feel that, among the other things that are utter failures in my life, my Christian experience stands first. I never had any Christian experience. I thought I loved Christ and wanted to do right, and I said so when I united with the church. But I tell you truly, Mrs. Spafford, I have not known anything about him. I have done nothing to please him, and I shouldn't know how to commence. And besides," she looked down now, and a deep flush spread over her heretofore pale face, "I will tell you the truth," she said, after a moment of hesitation. "I suppose it is very wicked, indeed, I know I am very wicked, but I will speak the truth to-day if I never do it again. If I could please my husband, make his home what it should be, I shouldn't care whether I pleased anybody else or not, even Christ." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of the Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Serving Christ in the Kitchen. If Mrs. Spafford was shocked by this last sentence, she had resolved not to show it either by voice or manner. It became apparent to her that Mrs. Evans was under too strong excitement to weigh her words carefully, or to have a realizing sense of what they conveyed. And while this loyal servant of Christ felt with a thrill of pain that it might be, and doubtless was, too true, that this woman was putting the earthly love before the heavenly, still the present did not seem the fitting time to help her realize the sin and folly of this. She spoke in calm, reassuring tones. "Christ smiles on all unselfish human love, you know, and on none more surely than that sanctioned by marriage vows. And true women love and honor you for your desire to be all that a wife can, not ignoring, as too many do, the little things of life. Now, dear Mrs. Evans, do you mind putting somewhat into detail the difficulties that just now present themselves? Possibly they are such as my longer experience can help you surmount. I do not, of course, mean a detail that will be unpleasant to you, but, in short, let us lay aside formality entirely. I am a neighbor, and I am a friend. Let me help you. What is the special burden today? You see, I am well aware that each day in a housekeeper's life has its special burden." At the sound of her visitor's quiet voice and matter-of-fact sentence, Mrs. Evans, who was not by nature a lover of scenes, and who had been really struggling to regain composure, felt her overwrought nerves growing calmer, and presently said, a vivid flush overspreading her face, "I can hardly see how you can help despising me. I almost despise myself. The simple truth is so very humiliating. I have been acting like a spoiled child instead of a woman. Nothing is very dreadful. Indeed, nothing dreadful in any sense has happened. It is just a culmination of small difficulties. They have been gathering and gathering about me for weeks, and this miserable afternoon I broke down under them." Her lip was quivering, and she was on the very verge of breaking down again. "It is the old story of the last straw that disabled the poor camel," said Mrs. Spafford good-humoredly, without a trace of sentiment in her voice, and yet, someway, the voice conveyed sympathy. "I know all about that. I have had just such days. Sometimes the last straw is an exceedingly hateful, ill-shaped one. In what form did it appear to you?" A little gleam of a smile quivered for a moment on Mrs. Evans's face. "It is ill-shaped, certainly," she said quickly, and I think she has been more hateful during the last 3 or 4 days than I ever thought a human being could be. Mrs. Spafford, my Betty went away this morning just before lunch time. She has only been with me 4 weeks, and has been by far the worst one of them all. I have had 9. This morning she served the most insufferable breakfast. Burnt toast and dreadful coffee. I don't know what she could have done to it, nor to the chop for that matter. I know we couldn't eat it. Even the potatoes were dreadful. Baked potatoes. I didn't think they could be spoiled, but these were soft and wet, and oh, miserable. Mr. Evans went to his business without so much as a cup of coffee or a bit of bread, and when I went into the kitchen, as soon after as I dared, to remonstrate with Betty a little, and to see if she could not promise to try to do better, before I had spoken a dozen words she became fearfully angry, used dreadful language, declared she was overworked and underpaid. She was what they call a cheap girl, Mrs. Spafford. This last spoken with a burning blush. I thought I would try her, and see if a little of our heavy expense could not be cut down in that way. But indeed, I paid her what she said she had been getting, and you know for 2 of us she hardly could be overworked. Mrs. Spafford hardly knew whether to laugh or cry over the anxious questioning sound in the trembling voice. Its owner had evidently been terribly shaken by the formidable Betty in the morning, and could not yet speak of her with composure. "And what was the conclusion of Betty's wrath?" she asked, resolved not to commit herself by giving an opinion either way at present. "Oh, she went away. She said she would, declared that nothing could tempt her to be abused in this house any longer, and she would warn every girl against me. She would leave my character at the intelligence office, and I would find myself spotted, whatever that means. I was perfectly amazed. I had not said anything to call forth such an outburst, and I thought she was excited over something else, and would quiet down if I left her to herself for a while. So I went away, and stayed upstairs all the morning, so that the sight of me would not anger her. But when I discovered that it was long after lunch time, I came down to see why she had not rung for me, and to make some arrangements for dinner this evening, and she was gone. And oh, Mrs. Spafford, if you could see the kitchen she left!" Whereupon Mrs. Spafford drew a little breath of relief. Then the poor lady had been too much absorbed in her grief to realize that her guest had seen it. "The fire was entirely out, and the breakfast dishes not touched, and a great many dishes that must have been used yesterday and left unwashed, standing around. Kettles, you know, and saucepans, and ugly, greasy, black dishes, with things sticking to their sides." Nothing more utterly disgustful than the look on Mrs. Evans's face can be imagined. Her guest's laugh rang out merrily at last. She could not help it. But her friend's trials were too real to admit of laughter. "It is dreadful," she said with a meek face, "to be foolish and so dependent upon others, but I have really been in utter despair this afternoon. Not for that reason simply," she hastened to explain, while the shadow instantly deepened on her face, "but as you say, it was a sort of last straw. Not so much of a straw to me either, for I never made a coal fire in my life, and though I tried hard to set that one going, the ugly black lumps looked fiercely at me, and stayed as black as before, after all the waste paper in the house had been used, and a great many matches. Mr. Evans certainly ought to expect his dinner when he gets home, since he went without his breakfast. But what can he possibly find to eat in this house I cannot see, and the rain was so steady it prevented my going out to find another girl. Indeed, to tell you the truth, I had a horror of trying to get another. It seemed to me I would rather starve, and so the whole miserable sense of my failure in every way as a mistress, or as a worker, rushed over me, and in addition to all the rest, just overwhelmed me. Dear Mrs. Spafford, I don't know why I am telling you all this foolish, unwomanly story, wasting your time and pouring into your ear a tale that can certainly be nothing but weariness to you. It is not like me thus to parade my annoyances. It is not, indeed. I ought to beg your pardon." She had sat erect during this last sentence, dried away the last tear from her hot cheek, and was struggling hard to put on the sweet dignity of hostess, which was generally so becoming to her. Meantime, her guest thought rapidly, taking a surreptitious glance at her watch. Should she insist upon taking this troubled wife to tea with her, sending little Tim, who did her errands, down to watch for the car that generally brought the two husbands, and so have one of those quiet tea parties that she was always telling Warren about? Her bread was fresh and excellent. She had made a treat for supper in the shape of a soft ginger cake, and the potatoes which she meant to warm, by the addition of a few breadcrumbs and an egg, could be made into patties, and do duty for 4. Oh, yes, the way was plain enough, to carry out this project, but was it the best way? Swift thinking, even while Mrs. Evans was trying to call back her matronly dignity, then she shook her head. No, it wouldn't do. The sore-hearted young life was not in a tea-party mood, and it was just possible that there had been words passed between husband and wife during the attempt at eating that uncomfortable breakfast, which had made wounds. If this were so, they could be better healed between husband and wife alone. She must give up her little tea. Then the other plan should be made to work. She slipped her watch back into its pocket and spoke briskly. "You are telling me all this because you are a sensible woman, and paid me the compliment of believing my offer of sympathy sincere. And you know that, to a Christian woman, there is no higher privilege than to be able to help a sister in Christ. Now, dear friend, listen to me. I don't wonder a kitchen left in the plight which you describe should look formidable to you, but it doesn't to me. I have conquered one many a time, coal fire and all. Moreover, I can show you how to do it so that it will cease to be a hopeless thing to you. Now, I want you to further prove your faith in my hearty friendship by letting me go with you right into that said kitchen, and reduce it to a state of meek and dainty subordination. Then you will get your husband as nice a little supper as he ever ate in his life, get it with your own 2 hands, and my word for it, he will have an unusual appetite." With eyes that were full of astonishment did Mrs. Evans for a moment gaze on her guest. That this proposal brought her into contact with a form of friendship to which she had heretofore been a stranger was evident. That she was puzzled to know how to receive it was equally evident. Only a moment the look of bewildered irresolution rested on her face, and then she said suddenly, "I believe you do mean every word you say. Thank you. I need help. I believe I need just the kind that you are willing to give. I will accept it gratefully." There was a happy light in Mrs. Spafford's eyes. This simple, sincere answer had shown her that she was not mistaken in her estimate of this fair young housekeeper. She was a woman to be helped, not only, but to be loved. Feeling still assured in her heart that this was no time for more important matters, without more ado Mrs. Spafford urged an immediate assault on the kitchen, and thither the 2 women went, Mrs. Evans only pausing to say in a distressed tone, "If I only had a large apron that would protect your dress." "Never mind," her guest answered cheerily. "My dress is only calico, and washes nicely." Then she set to work on that forlorn stove. "You see," she said, resolving upon working and lecturing at the same time, "coal is splendid for burning after it has been coaxed long enough. It is very hard-hearted, needs a pretty large gathering of kindlings blazing all around it to set it a good example. I suppose this is the place where they are kept, is it not? Your house is arranged like mine." Saying which, she opened a door, disappeared for a moment, and returned with her arms full of neat billets of wood of uniform length. These she built up with skillful interlacing, inside the wide-mouthed monster, Mrs. Evans looking on with interested yet incredulous face. She had had an experience with these heartless black lumps that the skillful engineer was piling in with such composed face. She did not believe they would burn. But they did. "They are conquered," the younger lady said with a relieved sigh, as the flames shot up through the interlacings and curled themselves skillfully around the black lumps, which soon began to emit a flame peculiar to themselves. They recognize a superior power, and do not dare to act as they did with me so short a time ago. Now, if you are a skillful general of a disordered kitchen, possessing the ability to marshal pans, kettles, and pails into orderly ranks, and make them retire to their places, you know how steadily the small kitchen yielded to the spell that was now upon it. If, on the other hand, you have the misfortune to be one of those who, though able to play 16 pages of Chopin, or some other distinguished composer, without a mistake, yet look with absolute dismay, yes, even terror, on the interminable paraphernalia of a well-stocked kitchen, you can appreciate the feelings with which Mrs. Evans watched the rapid transformation of hers. They were such tiny places after all, kitchen and pantry, and the water was so hot, and soap so plentifully used, that, to a skillful workman, it could not, you know, take much time, but it looked like magic to Mrs. Evans. "I wish I could do it," she said eagerly, as she lifted the shining plates from their bath in the hot rinsing water, and set them to drain, after the copy which had been set her. "How smooth they feel, and how shining they are! Betty would not recognize one of them. Mrs. Spafford, I tell you truly, if I only need not have another of those girls enter my house, I should be happy enough to shout. I cannot tell you what a terror they all are to me. They do nothing right, and I know just enough to be sure of that, but I don't know how to help it, and I am afraid of them all." "Why don't you do without them?" said Mrs. Spafford coolly. "Little bits of homes like yours and mine are too small and precious for hired hands to touch, if we have strength enough to guard them from it. I just enjoy getting dinner for Warren, and we have the coziest little breakfasts." Mrs. Evans's eyes brightened wistfully. "If I were only you," she said, and she thought of the $3 that had to be transferred each week from her purse to that of her tormentor. If it could be saved! "If I were only you! But I don't know anything about it." "Learn," said Mrs. Spafford coolly, as though it were a very simple matter. "You would be surprised to see how soon you could manage this nice little home to your entire satisfaction. Mrs. Evans, what are we going to get for a treat for your husband this evening?" The bright look faded from the weary housekeeper's eyes. "There is very little in the house," she said, her cheeks flushing. "It rained so, I depended on Betty. I meant to have a leg of lamb and some vegetables." "Too late for those," declared the cook. "Besides, we want to be dainty, you know, not go into anything so gross as legs of lamb." This with a merry laugh. "I see a dish of potatoes in the pantry. Do you ever stew them in milk? We used to have cream when I was a girl, and lived where milk was a necessity, not a luxury, but now I use milk, and find it answers nicely. I can show you how to serve a dish that I fancy you will enjoy." Mrs. Evans gratefully agreed to be shown, notwithstanding the fact that in her ignorant heart she was skeptical about making that ugly-looking dish of cold potatoes fit to eat. Still, her forehead did not clear. "I wish Betty had controlled her temper long enough to have baked bread," she said sadly. "We have nothing but baker's bread, and my husband dislikes it so much." "Then let us have some dear little soda biscuits, as light as puff balls. I saw a cup of sour milk on the shelf, and felt just like taking it down and making something nice." "Sour milk!" said poor Mrs. Evans, aghast at the idea. "Yes, indeed. You have eaten the little white puffs often, I presume. They are easy to make. It is the very thing. I will set you to making them while I get the potatoes ready to cook. Then while they are baking you can cook the potatoes." "There is some steak," said Mrs. Evans hesitatingly. "Mr. Evans doesn't dine downtown. He only takes a plain lunch, so I like to have meat for him, but I don't know that I can manage steak." Very meekly she spoke. She knew no more about broiling steak than she did about those biscuits which Mrs. Spafford so composedly talked of her making. "Oh, yes, you can," declared the brisk voice. "That is easy. Now about the biscuit. There is a quart measure. First you sift a quart of flour, now just so much butter. Wait, this little plate will measure it nicely, and serve you for the future." Thus she moved with careful steps, putting her directions as clearly and as briefly as possible, until Mrs. Evans, her face flushed, her eyes shining, stooped and set in the oven a row of small, round balls that she verily believed would never be anything but burnt dough. How could anything so simple and so quickly done ever transform itself into something fit to eat? But when the stewed potatoes were tested with a delicious mouthful, according to Mrs. Spafford's direction, when the bit of juicy steak lay meekly between the wire gridiron, and was being skillfully turned, and emitted a delicious odor through the kitchen, and when the lumps of dough came out of the oven the plumpest, flakiest little puffs that her eyes had ever beheld, when the tea was steeping, and her husband's key was heard in the front door, and Mrs. Evans was alone, her good angel having but a few minutes before washed her hands, rolled down her sleeves, and vanished through the back door, having given this parting word, "Now, Mrs. Evans, I want you to tell me whether your husband likes stewed potatoes or not, especially of your stewing, and soda biscuit of your making." Mrs. Evans, thinking of her, of the words that she had spoken that day, of the work her hands had wrought, and of the courage and hope which she had breathed into her, had much ado to keep the tears from starting again. They would doubtless have had their way but for the fact that her delicately broiled bit of steak was ready to be served. The tears were stayed, but her heart was full of grateful love, as she said to herself, with a resolute little pressure of her lips, as though she were speaking the words in her heart, "She is a blessed woman. I believe God sent her to me in my misery. She doesn't know all she has done for me today. There is something else that she can teach me. I shall know the difference between her religion and mine. She has something that I have not, and if it is for me, I mean to have it." "You will have to dine off bread and milk tonight," declared Mrs. Spafford, with smiling eyes, to her astonished husband, who was reviving their neglected fire when she appeared through the rain at the side door. "I have been out all the afternoon. I found an open door which I have entered, I verily believe, for the Master's sake." "God bless you," he said, looking down on her tenderly, when she had told so much of her story as she felt she had a right to tell. "If you can make a home over there, like this of ours, I believe you will save 2 souls instead of 1 from shipwreck." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of the Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. The Ends Meet. It is not my purpose to give you a detailed account of my friend Mrs. Spafford's life, nor of her plans of work. Indeed, I could not if I would. The story of a life must, of necessity, be fragmentary, bits here and there from actual everyday experiences. It may be that some have mistaken my design in telling you somewhat of this true woman's experience. I may have been expected to give in detail the management of a Christian household on small capital. All the little economies, the plans, the self-denials, the failures. Such was by no means my intention. Mrs. Spafford's quiet economies and self-denials shall be left like those of hundreds of other Christian women, with God and her husband. I may even have been expected to prove that she found it possible to keep to the Bible doctrine of tithe-giving and yet not starve. Thank the Lord that many and many a Christian life proves that. There is little need that Mrs. Spafford's history should be added. The truth is, I love to linger over these first beginnings, but there is need for haste, and I must ask you to step over a chasm of almost 2 years before you take another peep at the pretty little home. And I must own that you will find it in shadow. There has been much sunshine during those 2 years. There has been progress in the mission work to which my friend has devoted as much of her means and her heart as was possible. There has been a white day in her life when she went to the great reunion of Christian women, met to compare notes and devise plans for the future. She has had the pleasure of seeing a great church filled to overflowing with Christian women, women on the platform presiding, planning, managing, with the skill of generals trained to the service, and enlisted for life or during the war. She has heard the voice of prayer from lips that were once unaccustomed to the service, and from lips that once were sure they could not speak, save in the solitude of their own rooms. She has heard addresses such as thrilled her heart and nerved all her powers to new effort, addresses from the lips of women. She has even lived to see Mrs. Bacon appointed a district collector for the Woman's Board, and heard her offer, in silvery tones, an address of welcome to delegates from a distance. Oh yes, she knew the world moved. Meantime, it had moved in a quieter, but no less certain way, right around her. I hope you do not imagine that that cooperative business enterprise was a failure? I very much doubt whether anything begun as that was, with such an end in view, and guided every step of the way by prayer, is ever a failure. Certainly this was not. The Stowell parlor had found its level. A bright, long room, lighted with many windows, brightened with flowers in summer time, and with potted plants and flourishing vines in winter, brightened, the windows and the tables, with every variety of glowing color in worsted and silk. Every step of the way had been a success, that is, after they were fairly started. There were always drawbacks at first with which to contend. There were some to say that the scheme was a wild one and would never succeed. There were some to grow weary of it very soon and abandon their efforts. There were some to sigh and predict failure because the whole world did not rush in upon them from the very first to admire and to buy. And yet it had moved steadily forward. It was on an assured footing now. There was every sort of fancy article to be had that you might choose to order. If not in stock, the trim white-aproned miss, with demure face and laughing eyes, who waited on you with pencil and paper, and announced herself the order clerk, would quietly take your minute directions, taking care that they should be minute by becoming a skillful questioner, taking care that they should be in black and white, with your own name appended, and the date at which you might expect the same, taking care, too, that you should have a duplicate, so that you might expect neither more nor less than had been ordered. So careful was this new firm of its reputation. There was a variety counter, where could be found pins and needles and thread and tape and buttons, of exactly the right size and color and shape. There were endless little useful articles belonging to that class of goods that people never think about until they see, and then know they must have right away. It took a little time to accustom the patrons to the fact that this unique store was only open on one afternoon of each week, and then for a limited time. For the first few weeks, the partners were continually informed that if they were open every day, they would get a great deal more custom. Gradually, however, ladies began to say, "I suppose I could wait until Saturday for that purchase, and then buy it of the girls. It would encourage them." In the course of time, this statement also changed, and took the form of, "Oh, wait until Saturday and buy your buttons, or your edges, or your collars, at the what-not," for such was the simple, suggestive name that their establishment assumed. "It will really pay you to wait. They have such a nice variety, and are so very reasonable in their prices. Besides, if they haven't exactly what you want, they will take your order, and manufacture or purchase for you. They have a buying clerk who can really suit you better in the city than you can yourself, and save all the wear and tear of running around besides." When Mrs. Spafford knew that this form of talk had come to be the prevailing one, as regarded their place of business, she settled down into satisfaction. Of the constant strain upon time and strength and patience that it was to this one woman to keep all the wheels of her delicate machinery properly oiled and running smoothly, I will not attempt to tell. She had one all-sustaining motive. She knew that it was, with her, work done literally for the Master. She earnestly believed that it was not only an institution for making a little money in a legitimate way, but that it was a training school. For were not all these young ladies connected with the firm, learning, not only to earn, but to give systematically, regularly, conscientiously? In Mrs. Evans she had found just the helper she needed. It was her exquisite taste, backed by the other's educated judgment, that secured to the firm its reputation for having just the very things that matched, and that one wanted. As for Mrs. Evans, what had not the enterprise done for her? Of the earnest, active young ladies' band that had grown out of this enterprise, or rather grown along with it, and become a vital element of its existence, it shall be my pleasure to tell you more at length some other time. For the present, let it rejoice your heart to know that the scheme widened daily, not only as a business, but as a circle of influence. Nothing that she had ever undertaken, with an eye single to the glory of her Master, had so filled Mrs. Spafford's heart with joy and gratitude as did this whole matter. Yet, as I told you in the beginning, over the small happy home there had come shadows. Not light ones, drooping low for a little, then flitting away. Oh, there had been many such, of course. Mrs. Spafford had expected them. She was not a child, nor yet an enthusiast. It had not been an easy matter at all times to make ends meet. Especially had such been the case when extra expenses came upon them, for they had had many an extra expense. Who has not? Many a time had the careful accountant rejoiced over that fund, ever so tiny though it was, which she had been able to lay aside from time to time as an extra. Many a time had she rejoiced over the monthly dividends from the little firm, which, though so small that they would have made a business man shout in derision, had added not a little to her hoarded extra. Out of the necessity for this extra had also grown great satisfaction. For the husband, looking on, with eager eyes, helping where he could, standing in manly admiration where he could not, was one day enabled to get his eyes open so wide that he discovered even 5 cents for a cigar to be an expense that he certainly could avoid if he chose, and seeing the example ever before him of self-forgetful economy, he could not but choose. It is true, his eyes were opened wider than that. In laying it aside, he first discovered what an almost necessity it had become, and over this discovery he was so shocked that I think he would have had courage to continue the struggle even without the motive of economy. But that it was a struggle at all was a mortification to him. "I declare," he said to himself, speaking firmly, "I'll never be a slave to any habit. I did not dream of such a thing. If 5-cent pieces should ever come as plenty with me as flies in August, and there is no danger, I'll never smoke cigars again." Not long thereafter his eyes were opened wider. He had not thought to tell Callie. It was such a small matter, and he was half ashamed that he had not done it before. It did not seem necessary to let her know what a struggle it had been. So he kept his small secret. At least, he thought so. As if such a husband could keep a secret from such a wife. "What has become of them?" she asked him one evening. And so innocent of her feeling was he that he asked in astonishment, "Of what?" "The cigars that were to piece out your lunch?" "Oh, why, become of them? I dare say they are smoke by this time. Somebody has puffed them into thin air, though I didn't. How did you know, Callie?" She gave him only a very searching and very happy look in answer. Then, after a minute, "How could I help knowing? Why did you do it, Warren?" A variety of reasons, little cross-questioner. In the first place, it occurred to me that, although a very small leak, it was one that might as well be stopped. You see, you set me such a persistent example on that score that I could not well help learning. And then, well, Callie, I don't know how you discovered anything about it, but you may as well know the truth. I found the habit had grown on me, was harder to break than I supposed, much harder. I could hardly have believed what a struggle it would be, and that convinced me that I must break off not only for the present, but forever. Of course, the Lord's freedmen cannot afford to bind themselves with any sort of chains. When they knelt together for family worship, which they did in a very few minutes after this conversation, there was that in his wife's prayer, in the words and in the quiver of her voice, as she laid her joy before the Lord, that her husband said, directly they arose from their knees, said it with his arms clasped close around her, "My dear, if I had known, if I had dreamed, that it was such a sorrow to you, I should have turned from the whole thing long ago. What self-gratification is there important enough for a man to be the cause of an hour of pain to his wife?" "Then I ought to have told you long ago how I felt," said Callie, her eyes brimming with glad tears. "And I think so, too. At the same time, I admit that she thought within her glad heart that not all men were like her husband in his willingness to give up self for his wife's sake. And I am afraid I think that, too." Meantime, though I am long in introducing him, there was another and a very important reason why Callie was glad. Do you think she wanted the father of her son to set him an example as a tobacco smoker? Not she. Where is the mother who does? And the boy was 6 months old, able to watch with very wise eyes what was going on in the world. Who is going to say how soon he might have thought the curl of cigar smoke in the air a very pretty thing? Or how early he might have become accustomed to a tobacco-tainted breath as something inseparably connected with his small world? His name, of course, was Warren, but what did the glad young mother call him for a pet name but War? I am not sure that there was not a queer significance to the name in her heart. What war there had been between her scantily filled purse and her conscience during the days when she was fashioning his cunning little garments. Dear me! Doesn't every mother know all about it? The lovely embroidery, the delicate flannels and muslins, and cambrics and lawns, too fine and fair and sweet for any but those who seem to have just come from heaven, the little babies. Yet this mother had come off victor. Soft flannels? Oh, yes, indeed, they were in her estimation a necessity. Delicate white robes, many of them, they too were necessities. But they were not so fine, nor so long, nor so daintily tucked as the mother's fond, foolish heart would have liked, and the embroidery, that apparent necessity to baby existence, if we may judge from the wardrobes of many, was very scarce. Embroidery, such as she would have liked her darling to wear, would make awful inroads on the scanty purse, and embroidery such as she could make, she was well aware, made awful inroads on time and strength. So she made war with the wish to smother her darling under such costly folly, and, as I said, came off victor. It wasn't so hard, after she went shopping one day with a lady who paid $3 for 1.25 yards of the pretty stuff, and would not join the missionary society because she could not afford it. "After all," she said to Warren, "such people help. They make one see the folly, the inconsistencies in things more quickly than they can be shown in any other way." But her perverse husband answered, "Then it is a pity they wouldn't work a trifle faster, and let more people see it." Yes, I am telling a true story. They did it. 6 months had there been this pretty little new body to think of and care for, and not a penny of debt incurred. Neither had a penny been borrowed from the sacred jewels in the box on the mantel. It wasn't easy, oh dear no. There was much self-sacrifice, much planning, much diligent forethought and afterthought. There were quiet little self-denials practiced, which cost some strength of will, but which, after all, left the head and heart calmer, perhaps, than they would otherwise have been. There were industrious hours over plain sewing for certain neighbors, who were glad to get a deft needlewoman so convenient to them. There was every penny of the carefully hoarded extra used. Why not? They had said gaily to each other, this happy mother and father, "Isn't he a blessed little extra?" And they had kissed him until he cried. Ungrateful baby! It needs planning and patience and sacrifice, but it can be done. Don't I tell you it was done? Yet the shadow fell. The hot days came and hot nights when the baby fretted and moaned, and in many ways made good, so his father declared, his right and title to his pet name. These nights were followed by weary days when the mother toiled and felt she had not strength to do, and so left undone, with a conscientious self-sacrifice that only those can understand who have been obliged to turn away from duties that they longed to perform. If baby had only kept well, the long, warm days would have been lived through joyfully, but he grew steadily weaker and thinner. They did not tell their grave forebodings to each other, this husband and wife, and by so much more did they press heavily on each heart. Still they tried to be brave before each other. But the father's very step, as he hurried up the little walk when the business day was done, grew to have a nervous, anxious sound in it, and his eagerly put question, before the door was fairly opened, "How is he to-night, Callie?" had such an undertone of pain in it, that she, in pity, learned to watch for his step, and to say with a smile, when she could, "We are no worse, I think, papa." Yet they both knew that not to be better was in reality to be worse. "If we could only get to cooler quarters," the father said occasionally, and directly he had spoken he turned away quickly from his wife's wistful eyes. Truly, they felt as though it would have been almost as reasonable to talk about getting to heaven. Meantime, another anxiety menaced them. "Mr. Spafford," the senior partner of the firm had said to him, "you must hold yourself in readiness to go to Paxton at an hour's warning. There is some business pending which may result in our having to send you out in haste. The fact is, Howell and Company are in difficulties, and I'm afraid—" At this point he pushed to the outer door and drew his chair nearer his clerk, and there ensued a business explanation, to the details of which Mr. Spafford had much ado to give attention, distracted as he was with the query as to how he would manage about leaving Callie and the boy, and with the awful thought, what if the boy should grow worse in the night while he was away? He did not like to admit even to himself that the baby's illness was such as to justify him in asking to be excused from the trip. If he had, he was by no means sure it would have done any good. His employers were men not given to thinking of much that did not concern business. Still, he made all necessary preparations for his wife. She heard the news with a dismayed face, yet promptly realized the importance of satisfying his employers. "I wish Mrs. Evans were at home," was the instant outreach for help. She knew many people, and they were very kind, and she liked them, yet, after all, how few there are among our acquaintances whom we are willing to call in to be one with us in perplexity and trouble. Mrs. Evans had come to be such an one, but she had gone with her husband into the country during his vacation. "Addie Stowell would stay with you," her husband said, "and Charlie will sleep here to be within call, in case you should need—" He did not finish the sentence. He knew he would be understood. There was always before them the possibility of baby growing suddenly worse, and the need of a summons to the doctor. So all the preparations were made, though Mr. Spafford said cheerily, "After all, I may not have to go." And as the days passed, and he heard no more about it, and a little cooler weather came, and the baby seemed better, the cloud lifted. So Mr. Spafford was not prepared for his senior employer's sudden message, delivered very near the close of a busy day. "Mr. Spafford, we have had bad news from Paxton. I'm afraid our worst fears are to be realized. Still, you may be able with promptness to effect something. You will need to start at daylight. I regret that there is no earlier train, but that will bring you in soon after midnight, ready for early work the next morning. Well, sir?" This last in an inquiring tone, for, preoccupied with business as he was, he could not fail to see the swift dismayed look that overspread his clerk's face. The dismay was very apparent in the tones of his voice. "But tomorrow will be Sunday." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Measured by Trial. "Well," said the senior partner, irritation visible on every line of his face, "I am aware of that, of course. On ordinary occasions we are not in the habit, as you know, of infringing on the Sabbath rest of our employees, but this is a special emergency. A large amount of money is at stake, and you can, of course, see the necessity for your being in Paxton at the earliest possible hour on Monday morning." Without doubt, his clerk was listening to the measured words, every sentence of which indicated the senior's annoyance in thus being called to account, and obliged to explain his actions. He was listening, but he seemed in doubt as to how to answer, for he hesitated, and the blood mounted higher in his face, and the silence between them was becoming oppressive. At last, raising a pair of keen eyes, he spoke in a firm yet sufficiently respectful tone. "I cannot engage to break the Sabbath, sir, even in a business emergency." "You cannot?" "No, sir. My principles, prejudices, some might call them, are very strongly marked in that direction. I cannot conceive of a business emergency which would make it seem right to me to ignore the plain direction, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." For a moment the senior partner seemed to be too much astonished to speak. He was not a high-tempered man, at least not in the sense in which that phrase is generally understood. He never scolded, never descended to the level of loud words or excited tones, yet his word was absolute, unquestioned law through the entire establishment, and it had heretofore been Mr. Spafford's business simply to obey. In view of the long education that this man of large business had had as an undisputed sovereign, it is perhaps no wonder that he could for a moment only look his astonishment over the sudden rebellion. "Very well," he said at last, turning away and moving with his usual dignified step toward the inner office. The words were quiet, the manner in no sense changed, yet Mr. Spafford knew that he was in great and dangerous disfavor with his chief, knew it as well as he did less than an hour afterward, when one of the cash boys gave him a note written in the senior partner's clear, firm hand, which read as follows: "Enclosed fine check for $50, the amount due, and accept the thanks of the firm for the faithful manner in which you have hitherto served them. We shall, of course, have no further need of your services after today. Hoping that you will in the future meet with the success that your industry deserves, we remain yours truly." And then, through the mist that the faithful clerk felt gathering over his eyes, he could see the signatures of the firm. He even took occasion to notice the graceful curve of the capital B and the flourish around the D. So small were the details with which his mind occupied itself. And yet he also saw his home, with his beloved wife and its sick baby, and the great and increasing need that there was for money. He saw himself out of employment for weeks, perhaps for months, and his baby growing worse, slipping away from them perhaps for want of those things which money could procure. He saw actual want staring them in the face. Yet he went on with the column of figures he was adding, reached a result that he knew was correct, signed the name of the firm to half a dozen papers, wiped his pen with usual care, closed and locked his desk, delivered the keys to the proper authorities, said "Good evening," much as usual to his fellow clerks, and went out, for the last time, from the store where he had served faithfully. Yet the weight of the trial had told somewhat on his face by the time he reached home. Must have done so, though he strove hard not to let it, and said to himself, as he went up the walk, that he would not tell Callie until after supper. Nor then, indeed, unless the baby was even better than usual. Yet he had not been in the little dining room 5 minutes before she said, "Warren, what is the matter?" Then, of course, he told her. He spoke cheerfully, even smilingly, tried to make as little of it as possible, but she stood bewildered. She seemed unable to take the idea in. "Discharged?" she said. "Discharged?" repeating the word in a dazed sort of way, thinking how strange it sounded connected with her husband's name. "Why, Warren, what can you mean?" Then the whole story had to be gone over, and, after all, it was well. It was such a short story, so simple and untragical in its details, that it might almost have quieted the excitement of them both to go over it. Yet it meant to them serious business. They both knew it meant, "We have lost that which was our daily bread." There was no bank account, however small. There was not even an "extra" laid away in the private slide of Callie's writing desk. There was only that last check, out of which to pay a month's rent and the doctor's bill, and provide the 100 daily necessities of life for how long? I will not deny that there was a sense of terrible sinking in Mrs. Spafford's heart. She had never longed for money as she did just now, as she had been longing that very afternoon, because of the white-faced darling in the crib, and she had never in her life touched so near to actual poverty. Yet the first thing she did, after she took in the entire situation, was to move her chair around the other side of the crib, closer to her husband's, and kiss his white forehead. And the first words she spoke were, "After all, Warren, there is nothing to regret. You did just what was right. Indeed, there was no opportunity for choice. You could not do otherwise, and the Lord knows all about it." Thus it was that the shadows in that home grew longer. The days passed strangely, that is, the first 5 or 6. Warren took his breakfast later, lingered over it, beyond the time for family worship, cared tenderly for War, in 100 ways restful alike to mother and baby, did a dozen little things for their comfort during the day that he had never before had time for, then went out on a weary round of calls in the hope of finding somewhere a situation, coming back every night a trifle more disheartened than he was the night before. It was not the time of year when vacancies were plenty, if, in fact, in the overcrowded city there is ever such a time. He got the check cashed, with a curious pitiful wonderment as to how or when he would get another, and paid the rent, and laid aside some that he hoped could be kept to give to the doctor, and brought home with him 5 little gold dollars that he showed after tea to his wife. "Oh, Warren," she said, understanding them at once, "I was wondering about them. Don't you suppose, do you think I mean, would it be wrong to use the $5 this time? We have no income now, you know, for a little, and baby needs a few things. Shall we borrow them for this emergency?" "Callie," he said, and his tone was low and strangely tremulous, though there was no reproach in it, "we promised to swing off and trust him for emergencies." "So we did, and I am very faithless. Put them in the box, Warren. Indeed, I did not mean to steal the Lord's jewels. I only thought of borrowing." She spoke quickly, and had some ado to keep back the tears. But he gave the shining things to her, and with her own hands she dropped them into the blue velvet box. Before many days they had that which put the loss of the father's situation into the background. Without any question, baby was seriously worse. Oh, the dark, dark days which succeeded each other now! How can I tell you about them? Ah me, how many hearts there are in this world that need no telling! The father made no more efforts to find a situation. Indeed, there were hours in which he was able to thank God that he had none, no duty to keep him from ministering now to his child and his wife, for one seemed to need help almost as much as the other. His days and nights were alike spent in tireless watching and waiting. That one word expresses to the initiated a whole volume in itself. Alert, helpful, watching, is sometimes not so hard, but the waiting for what may, apparently is coming, with slow steps indeed, but still coming, that is what wears out human lives. It was one of those breathless summer mornings which occasionally followed breathless nights. Baby lay in a limp, almost lifeless heap in the small white crib. Too weak he felt even to smile in answer to the wistful eyes bending over him. Neither father nor mother had left him for an hour of rest during the night. Indeed, there was not a spot in the house in which they could have rested had they tried. No spot where they could get away from that faint wail. Sometimes it seemed to the father's heart, when occasionally he closed his eyes for a moment to rest them, that he should hear it always, after this, wherever he went, whatever happened. The long summer night had stretched its slow length along, mother and father alternately walking up and down the room, trying to rest the tired baby, or sitting in the large rocker, pillowing him tenderly on one arm, and gently fanning him with the other. Now the longed-for morning had come at last, and as they looked at the pinched features of the child, and then at each other, they needed not words with which to say that the night had made sad ravages. It was plain that he had failed much. For the first time since his sickness, they did not attempt going through with the form of a breakfast. That much Warren Spafford had regularly insisted on. Indeed, he had several times made a fragrant cup of coffee himself, brought it with his own hands to his wife, and with tender firmness insisted on her drinking it. This morning he sat almost as limp and wearied-looking as the baby before him, making no suggestions in regard to food or rest. The awful depression of disappointment and foreboding was upon him. Mrs. Spafford turned to him at last, her eyes heavy, less with weariness than fear. "Warren, don't you think you might find the doctor before he starts on his daily round, and get him to come earlier? Don't you think there may be need of it?" "I am afraid there is." He spoke in a low, hopeless tone. It was evident to her that he had lost all heart. Her own began to give great throbs of pain, but she struggled for composure. For baby's sake she must not yield now. She might soon have plenty of time for tears, when she had empty arms. Warren rose at once. "I will try for it," he said, still listlessly, and he sought for his hat and went away, neither of them remembering to break their long night's fast. Meantime, however, there had come another presence into the house. Mrs. Evans had returned home but the night before, had run over immediately to see how her friends were, and knew all about the great fear that enthralled them. She came quickly now into the kitchen uninvited, as her kitchen had been entered once. She moved with quiet yet skillful step around the small domain where the neatness of desolation reigned. Everything was in the sort of order that betokens that very little is being used in that region. Skillfully she built up the fire in the little stove, Rapid movements to and fro, one journey home, and just as Mr. Spafford entered the front door, she pushed open the door of the little parlor which had long since been converted into a downstairs nursery. "I found him," Warren said. "He says he will try to be here in half an hour." Then Mrs. Evans, "Go right into the dining room, dear, you and Mr. Spafford, and eat a mouthful of breakfast. You will find it all ready. Oh, yes, you must, for baby's sake, you know. He will need strong arms and a great deal of care to-day. He is sleeping quietly now, isn't he? Really resting, perhaps. I will sit beside him and watch every movement. Go, Mrs. Spafford, because it is right, you know." What winning sweetness there was in her voice, and a certain quiet persistence of manner that carried a sort of strength to the tired hearts of father and mother. "She is right, Callie," Warren said, trying to rouse from his lethargy. "Right and thoughtful. Don't let us be ungrateful. Come." Now you know just how this suggestion sounded to Mrs. Spafford. How utterly loathsome to her was the idea of food. How much she longed to be allowed to sit by her baby's side just as long as she could. Yet she struggled with all this that she knew was sentiment, and arose and went out quietly to the dining room. How pretty it looked on this fair morning! Mrs. Evans had even stopped to pick 3 or 4 fresh roses just budding into bloom, and had placed them in a tiny vase beside Mrs. Spafford's plate. The table was set for 2, with much daintier care than had been bestowed on it of late. The very freshness of the napkins had a restful look to the matron's weary eyes. There was a plate of delicately, carefully made toast, and a tiny bit of steak, broiled to a nicety, just as Mrs. Evans, thanks to her teacher, had long known how to broil. No wonder that it all reminded Mrs. Spafford of her afternoon invasion into the kitchen across the way. Her husband was evidently thinking of it too. "For thou shalt find it after many days," he quoted to her, with a meaning smile, and then, as she tried to give the answering smile, the very effort to do so brought the tears, and she laid her head on her husband's shoulder and sobbed outright. It was better, too, than to try to bear that heavy strain any longer. "Come," he said, after a moment of tender silence. "You are to show your appreciation of this thoughtful kindness, and eat some breakfast now. It will strengthen you for the day." He poured her coffee, prepared it carefully, cut small bits of the tender steak for her, as if she had been a child, and although she felt perfectly confident that the very first mouthful would choke her, she sat down and ate bits of toast and steak and swallows of hot coffee, and rose up refreshed. So determined are these bodies of ours to assert their rights, no matter what the spirit is being called upon to endure. The doctor came promptly, as he had promised, but it was evident to both father and mother that he saw small need for his coming. Rather, he stood powerless before the need that he felt himself unable to supply. He was kind and grave, as sympathetic as one could expect a doctor to be, who sometimes stood many times a day by the fair cribs of little babies who were slipping away from life. "The fact is," and he drew on his gloves as he said it, "Nature will have to do all that can be done for your child. He may rally. I have seen children lower than he pull through at last. The vitality of these little creatures is something to wonder at, stand in awe before, in fact. There is one thing I should like to see tried. If you could go to the seashore with him, it might do. Sea air works miracles sometimes in cases like these, and indeed a change of air is a most helpful thing. You may continue the medicine as before. I'll try to call this afternoon. We are likely to have a very sultry day, I think. Good morning." And this was all, and the dark-colored, nice-fitting gloves were on now and buttoned, and he was gone. All their hopes went out with him. They sat in almost stupefied silence, looking, not at each other, nor at the baby, but at nothing. trying, indeed, to look the future in the face. Go to the seashore! To be sure, it was not very far away, less than half a day's ride on the cars would bring them within the sound of its eternal roar. But for all practical purposes, so far as they were concerned, it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. Mrs. Spafford's eyes sought the jewel case on the mantel. There were 3 little gleaming dollars within, and she knew as well as though she could see inside her husband's pocket, that those and a few quarters were all the money they had in the world. $2 of the gold she had paid out mechanically but a few days before, when the church collector called. She thought of them now, thought of the dollars that had lain from time to time within its silken folds. 150, more than that, indeed, during the last 2 years. We could take him to the seaside if we had that. She did not speak the words even to her heart, they just flitted through her mind, and there was such a touch of bitterness in them that it startled her. Still, how was she to help wondering whether the money could possibly have done anybody so much good as it would be to save her darling? "Oh, Warren," she said, and her voice sounded like a wail, "couldn't we borrow that money in that box, and I'd take it and go a little way with baby? He said, you know, that a very slight change sometimes did great good." "My poor dear wife, don't you remember that what is there would hardly take you to the depot in a carriage such as it would be necessary to have?" Silence for a few minutes. Then she spoke in tones that were almost desperate. "Warren, I could beg for the sake of our child." "Darling, I would beg if I knew which way to turn. Let us think. No, dear Callie, let us beg of our Father, our great rich Father. He loves our child as even we cannot. He will show us the very best to do. Let us come right to him as children who trust him, and beg him to show us the way to step." Almost before the sentence was finished, they were on their knees. They were alone again. Mrs. Evans had packed the dishes in a scarcely orderly pile, and gone swiftly away, not pausing even to offer to sit with baby a moment longer, or to inquire what else she could do. It had occurred to both husband and wife to wonder silently over the suddenness of her departure. Then each had decided that some home duty must have needed immediate attention. She had been long absent. Several times since she went had the bell rung. Some kind-hearted neighbor had sent to inquire after baby's health. The girls, too, had rung at the door, and inquired and offered help, if there was anything they could do, and gone their ways. People were kind, but it was a city, where even neighbors were not specially neighborly, and the baby had been long sick, and none realized how sick he was, nor how much in need of help the young people stood. None but Mrs. Evans, and she had gone to her own cares. So they were alone. And yet not alone. Surely the angel of the covenant was with them during that prayer. Mrs. Spafford had often heard her husband pray, yet the intensity of feeling, the perfect abandon of self, the overwhelming cry to be hidden from this awful storm that threatened them, to be held in the everlasting arms, was something that hushed her sobs, and almost compelled her to lay hold with strong faith upon the arm of power. They were both entirely calmed when they rose up. "Darling," her husband asked, as he held her with his arm for a minute, "don't you believe, don't you know that he will bring to pass for us that which is best?" "Yes," she said quietly, and at that moment the doorbell rang again, a quick, emphatic peal. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. The Answer. "It is a note for you, Callie." Mr. Spafford said, as he returned from answering the loud peal of the bell. "The man who brought it is waiting for an answer." "Read it, please," his wife said. She was on her knees beside the crib, bending over her baby. A note from some downtown neighbor expressing sympathy, this was what she thought. It was very kind, but the mother was in the mood just then to feel that human sympathy was a very little thing. Some day she might be able to thank the writer for kind words. She did not think that she wanted to take time from her baby to read them now. Indeed, she expressed as much, while her husband was unfolding the sheet. "Did you say he was waiting for an answer? I cannot answer notes now." Then he read: "My dear Mrs. Spafford, I have but this moment heard of your trouble. We are on the eve of departure for our seaside house. Expect to take the 10:20 train. I send the carriage with this, and, my dear friend, do you and your husband with all speed get into it with that dear baby and come to us. I have known sea air to work marvelous transformations in baby lives. There is no time to lose in preparation. I would not, if I were you, delay 1 hour. We have a large cottage and ample accommodations for you all, and no more desirable spot could be found for a sick baby. Dick, our coachman, the bearer of this, is entirely reliable, and will drive you with the greatest care to the train, where we will join you. The journey is a short one. Do not wait to do any packing. Mrs. Evans, through whom I learned just now of your great anxiety, will pack a trunk with whatever you can need, and express to you promptly. Meantime, she is downtown purchasing, under my direction, sundry articles which I know to be needful to the comfort of sick babies who travel. I am the mother of 5 children. I know all about it. My dear friends, I feel so sure of your remembering that you are my brother and sister, that I do not imagine you as hesitating for a moment on the score of false pride. Our Father has entrusted me with ample means to pay all expenses of every sort, and directed me to take you, my dear kindred in Christ, under my care. I confidently expect to see you, for I know I am following the lead of Him who guides you and me. Mrs. Evans bade me say that you are only to throw together what may be immediately needed for baby's comfort. Bring your keys with you to the 23rd Street depot. She will meet you there, take your directions, and attend to whatever may need attention in your home. Yours in great haste, Helen V. Temple. Long before he had finished reading this remarkable letter, Mr. Spafford's voice had broken, and his eyes were so dim with tears that he could scarcely make out the words. The paper fluttered to the floor at last from his hands, and, voice too much beyond his control to check its tremble, yet spoke with intense feeling: "Before they call I will answer, and while they are yet speaking I will hear." As for Mrs. Spafford, she had one of those merciful fits of really unnatural self-control come over her at that moment. The intensely practical part of her nature rose to meet the strain, and served her well. She rose up from the crib, all the pallor gone from her face, and spoke in a clear, positive voice: "Warren, the baby's clothes in the middle drawer, you know. Tumble them into the large valise. His little cap and blankets are on the shelf in the clothes-press, in the blue box. My hat lies on the shelf, and my sack is hanging beside it. Is that 10 o'clock? There is no time to lose. Oh, Warren!" All the pent-up emotion, that if she had had time might have found expression, let itself out in those 2 words. Then she lifted her sleeping baby in her arms, and made swift yet tender preparation for a journey. I call you to witness to the true nobility of soul apparent in these 2, that not a momentary thought of shrinking back from the offered hand, stretched out with such lavish help, occurred to either of them. They were simply above shrinking away from help, sorely needed and royally offered. Mrs. Temple's manner of receiving them at the depot was perfect. A quick, tender clasp of the hand given to Mrs. Spafford, and low-toned words. "I am so glad you are here in time. We need have no confusion. He looks really quiet, doesn't he? The ride down has not disturbed him. I have great hope of him. Change of air is just what he needs. Mr. Spafford, suppose you seat us in the car while my husband is looking after tickets. Your wife will be able to get a little rest in the cars, I think." Not a moment's space did she leave for any attempt at thanks. On the contrary, she simply, and in a most natural manner, ignored any occasion for them, and gave herself entirely to the arrangement of details for the journey. Mrs. Evans came, at the last moment, flushed and breathless with the haste she had made, and deposited sundry packages on the seat beside Mrs. Temple, received from Mr. Spafford the keys, and a few hurried words of explanation, and the bell rang and the whistle blew, and they were off. Even then Mrs. Temple contrived to keep their thoughts and her own absorbed by the sick child. She was alert and fertile in her suggestions and arrangements for his comfort, and he showed his appreciation of her thoughtfulness by continuing his quiet sleep, so much more like rest than anything he had taken for days. Oh, you don't know, and the worst of it is I cannot describe to you, how that upper room, in which before night she was domiciled, seemed to Mrs. Spafford. A large bay-windowed chamber, delicately tinted walls, casement windows reaching from floor to ceiling, hung with simple muslin curtains, India matting on the floor, the lightest and simplest of cottage furniture, everything pure, tasteful, restful. The windows were set open toward the sunset, and just before her there spread out that wonderful sight, of which some eyes never tire, the white-sanded beach, washed forever by the ceaseless waves. She sat and listened to them as they rolled, one after another, always and always one after another, up and down the sands. She heard the steady monotone of their voices as they went on in their tireless work. She drank in the salt air. She watched the curtains sway back and forth in the breeze. She watched the baby in the crib lying quiet, sleeping, breathing in like herself the air that, it seemed to her, must be health-giving. She thought of the breathless room where they had spent but the night before. She remembered just how breathless it must be there at this moment, and her heart went out in unspeakable gratitude toward those who had of their abundance come to her in her sore need. To him who had put it into the hearts of his children to do this blessed thing. The door swung softly on its hinges, and Mrs. Temple entered, her face radiant with some new satisfaction. Only to look at it was like breathing fresh hope into the mother's heart. "Don't you think Dr. Everett is here?" she said, speaking eagerly. "He has just sent in his card, and asked if he could serve us in any way. He is an old friend. I took the liberty of sending word to him to call on us immediately. I knew you would like to have him see baby." Now, Dr. Everett was a name well known to Mrs. Spafford. He came from the same city as themselves, and only that very morning, when she sat with such a heavy heart looking down at her baby, after her physician had buttoned his gloves and departed, she had said to herself, "If I had only asked him to bring Dr. Everett with him! If I had only asked Warren to go for Dr. Everett this morning! What do I care how much he charges to come away up here? I could pay him in some way. I could beg it." Then she remembered, with another dull thud at her heart, that she had heard him bemoaned as out of town. Now, barely a day intervening, here was she out of town too, by the side of the life-giving sea, and behold, the great doctor was within reach. Not only that, but was coming that evening to see her baby. Was not her cup of mercy full? Isn't it a curious thing that histories which cover weeks of time to live can be grouped and put into a half-hour's story? The weeks at the seaside, which followed this first evening when Mrs. Spafford sat and watched the sun dip down beneath the waves, were weeks, the memory of which she will carry forever, even into heaven. So full of sweet, constant, merciful, loving kindness were they. Do you think that Mrs. Temple's kindness exhausted itself in the first day's effort? It is not so. Each passing day showed her as a marvel of thoughtful, unselfish wisdom. Thoughtfulness shone in ways that were easy to feel, but very hard to tell. There was an acceptance of Mr. and Mrs. Spafford as her guests for the season in a sort of matter-of-course manner. She made them feel free to come and go, to take and receive, as they might have felt in the home of an actual sister. Aye, as it is not possible always to feel even with sisters. She made herself one with them in their care and anxiety. She almost seemed to lift half the burden from them and bear it herself. Dr. Everett made his call and lingered beyond the time that his professional services were required, giving rather the care of a skilled nurse. He spoke hopefully, not too hopefully, because they who knew so well on what a thread the baby's life hung would not have been able to trust an emphatic assurance of safety. But he unbent from his grave professional air, and expressed, as well as felt, sympathy, and promised to come early in the morning, and came very early, and came several times during the day, and lingered as he could not have done had he been at home pressed with care. All this gave the Spaffords a certain relieved feeling that their baby was not merely one of the many sick and suffering babies, but a special object of the skillful physician's care. The mother expressed something of this feeling to Mrs. Temple one evening, and the manner in which that lady answered gave her a little lesson which she hugged to her heart and never forgot. "I have often thought," said the elder lady, a touch of sadness in her voice, "how hard it must be for the great Physician to bear with us in our determination to think of his love and care for us only as a piece of that which he bears for the great multitude, instead of individualizing it as he constantly teaches us to do, and accepting him as caring for us with even more than the exclusive tenderness of love which we give to our own. Of course it is only a seeming with human physicians. They must exclude us when they go from us to others, and think only of them. But the heart of Christ, you know, is for each, as if each were alone in all the world the object of his care." Mrs. Spafford had no answer to make for a moment, and when she spoke she only said, "Thank you," but the words were accompanied by a look which the other lady understood. Henceforth the young mother thought of Christ as bending over her baby in his crib, exactly as though there were no other baby on earth to claim his love and skill, and her heart was wonderfully comforted. Still she thanked him daily for the human help and comfort afforded through Dr. Everett. As the days passed, and he came and went, she grew to think of him as a personal friend. She looked back often upon that first evening of his coming, and smiled over her folly, and realized that it was but the vagary of an excited brain to be so glad, so very glad, that he wore no gloves, which he drew on and buttoned as he pronounced in slow, quiet words what seemed like a death-knell to her hopes. How foolish she was! Why did she care for gloves? What difference did it make how slowly the doctor drew them on, how carefully he buttoned them? Yet she found that the scene with just those little accessories had photographed itself on her brain, and all the darkness of that breathless morning came back to her, associated with that doctor standing beside her baby's crib, buttoning those gloves. Well, as the days went by, the steady kindness of those ministering never failed. Among Mrs. Temple's other thoughtful ways, there had been introduced to the household a middle-aged, calm-faced, low-voiced woman, who came in noiseless slippers and cool, dark dress, and the first time she lifted the baby in her arms, she cooed to him in so motherly a fashion that he laid his tired little head down on her shoulder and went to sleep. Then Dr. Everett, when he came, greeted her with a pleased face and a shake of the hand, and stepped to the piazza after Mrs. Spafford to say to her, "I see you have Mrs. Philbrick here. My dear madam, she is worth more to a sick baby than 40 doctors, or even than a mother who is tired as you. I recommend you to go to bed and sleep all night. Baby is safe in her hands, for she is the wisest and tenderest nurse I know." There had been no talk about a nurse, no nervous heart-rending discussion about substituting some other care for the worn yet tireless mother's, but Mrs. Philbrick stayed. "She is an old friend of the family, and has come to spend a few days with us," was Mrs. Temple's explanation, and she was always hovering within call, always motioning to the mother to lie down on the bed and let herself be covered with the baby's blanket or a light shawl, anything that would not look as though she had given up the baby and succumbed to fatigue, and the rests that she took thus were many and life-giving. Also, baby, with the rare wisdom common to his age, put in his powerful plea for resting both father and mother, by taking the most obstinate fancy to Nurse Philbrick, and waiting for her when she disappeared from sight. So, gradually and quietly, she came to be the recognized nurse, and the mother was learning to turn away from the crib with a great, deep sigh of restfulness, knowing that the weight of care was being lifted. Meantime, do you think this young couple, with not a penny in their purse and no visible means of earning one, were able to keep the bewildering future entirely from their thoughts? Yes, they were, almost entirely. But alas, that I should have to admit that the reason was not because of their conquering faith, but because all these thoughts were pushed out by a present and absorbing anxiety. They could not shut their eyes to the fact that, with all the advantages of sea air and Dr. Everett and Nurse Philbrick, it was a fierce fight between life and death that was being waged over that one little baby. Ever present before them was the question, how will it end? They bore up wonderfully well. They made brave efforts to sustain each other, to appear grateful and hopeful, and in a sense at rest. But they did not trust themselves to any confidential talks, to any hints as to what might be. They just watched and waited. It was at the close of a long, bright day, nearly 3 weeks since they first came to their seaside retreat. An eventful day it had been. Baby Warren had slept quietly through the night, had awakened in the morning, his face bright with smiles, had sat up in Nurse Philbrick's arms and played a little in the old fashion, had taken his cream with a relish unknown for many a day, and the mother watching him felt that she had surely a right to let it into her heart that he was genuinely, hopefully better. All through the day he had sustained this hope, returning to many of his pretty baby ways that they had thought laid aside forever. The doctor had spoken not only cheerfully, but almost gleefully, in his morning call, and when he came again in the afternoon, had said, as he arose to go, "Well, friends, my unusually long play day is over, and I must go back to the city tomorrow morning. I have delayed for several days, in order to have the pleasure of saying to you, madam, that I feel perfectly safe in leaving this young man now in your and Mrs. Philbrick's hands. I don't think he will need a physician's care any longer." Then I think the light on Mrs. Spafford's face went a great way toward paying the doctor. There had been talk after that, much of it, of course. Careful directions given, earnest gratitude expressed, and more than a hint of the strong feeling that could never be expressed in words, and then the doctor had gone away, richer by far than when he came, for he carried a weight of gratitude from 2 full hearts, and he would be enriched by their prayers so long as they lived to pray. It was just at evening, and they were alone. War had given his last touch of exquisite joy to the full day by playing for a little in the old-time rollicking fashion with his father's beard, the indescribable little coo in his happy voice speaking as plainly of returning health and strength as words could have done. Then he had gone to sleep. "Callie, see here," her husband said, turning aside from the crib, where both had been lingering, and putting a paper in her hand, which, by the sudden paleness that spread over her face, he knew she recognized as a doctor's bill. There it was, a long, long list of visits from one of the most eminent physicians in a great city. But the last line read, "Received payment, good measure, pressed down and running over. Leonard Everett." "Oh, Warren!" Mrs. Spafford said, and then this crowning act in their stream of mercies brought for the first time a rush of tears. "I have not cried before since we left home," she said, crying and laughing both in one as she spoke. They showed it to Mrs. Temple, that carefully receipted bill, and as they talked together of the doctor's skill and kindness, Mrs. Spafford said, "But the joy is not all ours. I think, Mrs. Temple, it must be glorious to have money, to be able to do royal things such as you and Dr. Everett are doing." And Mrs. Temple, with her hand resting on the younger woman's head, made answer, "Hush, dear, we have no money. It is all his. We are but stewards. Dr. Everett recognizes the kinship. Have we not all one Father?" End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, Measuring Human Influence. With careful tact did Mrs. Temple watch for just the right opportunity for checking any restiveness in the heart of her guests. She realized that, as their minds reacted from the heavy strain which had been upon them so long, the sense of dependence and poverty would assert itself, and tempt them to think of themselves as intruders. It was at the close of a lovely summer day that they sat on the piazza which commanded the finest view of the ocean, and discussed the future. Mr. Spafford himself opened the way by remarking that it must have been a very warm day in the city. "Yes," said Mrs. Temple, "and that reminds me of something over which I have been worrying a little. You will surely not think of taking baby back to the city until summer has entirely spent itself, will you? Our first months of autumn, you know, are liable to be quite as oppressive as midsummer. Baby had such a narrow escape that, it seems to me, you should hazard a great deal in trying to return before October at the earliest." The mother's heart gave a little thrill of satisfaction over this sentence. It was so pleasant to hear the past tense used in connection with her darling's illness. Others beside herself, then, accepted the danger as past. She was joyful and grateful. But the father's mind was occupied with another problem. He was thankful for the past and foreboding for the future. He was the breadwinner of this little family, and saw no way in which to win any. The rent, too, had been accumulating, he having had only promises with which to pay the last month's balance, and now another was nearly due. Every Monday morning, when Mr. Temple returned to the city, he had said cheerily, "I will keep a lookout for you, Spafford, and I think there will be an opening of some sort soon." But openings in the commercial world at this date were not so numerous, at least such as would support a man with a family. Young men by the dozens stood ready to absorb any opening, and be content with small salaries. So Mr. Spafford's face was clouded. "I must go back to the city as soon as I possibly can, and look for work," he said, speaking quickly. "You forget, Mrs. Temple, that I have nothing but your unparalleled kindness to live upon." "I don't think that is true," she made answer in quiet tone. "You have your father's sure promise. But I don't want to trammel you. When Mr. Temple comes down again, you and he, talking it over, may decide it best to go back together and make arrangements for the future. But in regard to your wife and baby, I feel exactly like meddling. I don't think I could endure it to have my baby taken back to the city until I felt that it was safe. He is my only grandchild, you know, and I may be excused perhaps for being selfish over him. I think, Mr. Spafford, you should lay your commands on mother and child to stay quietly here with me while you bear the heat and burden of the day. I shall not go to town until the very last of October, probably, and I need not try to tell you how lonely I should feel without the mother and baby. I suppose you and Mr. Temple could keep Bachelor's Hall together, if it should seem necessary?" What answer could be made to such persistent kindness? The guests looked at each other, and felt almost embarrassed by this wealth of hospitality. How were they ever to express their gratitude? Mrs. Spafford, studying for the 100th time the whole matter, suddenly put it into a question which she had longed to ask. "How came you to do it, Mrs. Temple? I mean, what induced you to take us in this unworldly fashion, and do for us, and with us, as if we were your very own?" "You make altogether too much of it," said Mrs. Temple, speaking lightly. "Is it so strange a thing that a woman with a house at her disposal, and leisure on her hands, should be heartily glad of pleasant friends about her for the summer? Especially when there was a baby like our War included? Still, I know what you mean. By what line of impulse or suggestion did it first occur to me? You will doubtless be surprised, my dear friend, to learn that you were the starting point. Do you remember that first missionary meeting downtown that you attended, and your prayer?" "I remember the meeting very well," Mrs. Spafford said, her cheeks flushing, "and the fact that I offered prayer, but what has that to do with this summer's experience?" "Much. There was that in your prayer which set me to thinking in a new channel. I had been accustomed to think of the foreign field as very widely separated from work at home. 2 channels, you know, each feeding the ocean of God's work for the world, but stretched apart to such a degree that those who gave their lives to feeding one channel could not do much, in any way, for the other. Something in your language and manner made me feel that they touched each other, joined hands indeed; that I could lay my hand on my next neighbor's shoulder, and speak a word, or look a feeling, that could be made to reach to Africa or China. I cannot describe it very well, nor make it very clear to you, what a hold the thought took upon me, but I know I looked about on those with whom I came in contact with very different eyes from that time forth. I had felt myself consecrated, time, money, and strength, to the work of foreign missions. My father died in the work abroad, and my 2 brothers and a sister labor there today. And in short, I lived for the other side of the world, and thought it right. I still think it right, but I see fresh ways of doing it. I can reach China through my neighbor that I meet on the street. I am constantly saying to myself, who knows but what that little girl may do for China when she grows into a woman? Who knows what millions that little fellow, playing at my neighbor's back door, may give for Japan or India? Am I making my meaning plain? I don't believe I am, but it is plain to me. When I heard of my blessed little War's illness, without any idea as to how I should come to love him as my very own, I instantly said to myself, how can I know but his life is to be saved through me, so that he may, in the years to come, touch all heathendom with his influence? I got that out of your own prayer, Mrs. Spafford. It came to me as it never had before, and I have enjoyed living twice as well since then. It is not that I love China less, you know, but my neighbor more. The Lord has opened fresh streams, and given me a chance to help swell their current for the same great end." And her eyes were shining with tears. Just at that moment there appeared in the door Master War Spafford, in Nurse Philbrick's arms. That devoted slave of his was to leave him on the morrow, and had been enjoying a last love scene with him in the nursery. His mother arose to take him, and, as she pressed his velvet cheek to hers, she said, her voice slightly tremulous with feeling, "We will try to train this little boy that the love and wealth you have lavished on him may bring an hundredfold reward to the foreign field." After that, both parents believed that they would have been silly, as well as ungrateful, to have pressed the idea of going away, in the face of Mrs. Temple's expressed advice to the contrary. Still, the father's face was shadowed, and he was plainly growing restive. Some move he must make, or his manhood would suffer. The dignity of suffering, and the foreboding of coming sorrow that had held him prisoner, were lifted. War was able to roll in the sand, and shout at the waves, and frolic, in one way and another, during every moment of his waking hours. His cheeks were growing round and plump again, and his eyes were bright with health and the joy of living. The father felt that he must be at work. But it was 2 days after the talk on the piazza that he was summoned to the parlor to meet a caller. The conference was a somewhat lengthy one, but he came away from it with a bright light in his eyes, and ascended the stairs 2 steps at a time in search of his wife. "Callie, dear," he said, going over to her, "I shall have to go to the city without you, and before the time we had planned." "Why?" she asked him, not startled. His face was too bright for any news that was not pleasant. "I think from your face, Warren, that you must have an opportunity for employment, and, indeed, I think from my heart that such must be the case. My faith has been stronger all the morning." "Then I can reward it with a bit of sight," he said gleefully. "Callie, do you remember that carpet clerk of whom we bought our carpet, how interested he seemed in our twists and turns to save a penny, and how patient he was with us?" She remembered him perfectly, the wife declared, and moreover had often thought of him, and wondered whether he had a happy home. "Well, it is he who has been calling on me. He brought me great news. Mr. Temple, it seems, had heard that there was a vacancy in their house, and called in person to present my name. But there were a dozen applicants, and, but for what we are apt to term an accident, it would have done no good. Mr. Johns, the carpet clerk, was standing by, and recognized my name. It seems he had been more or less interested in us ever since. His little sister met you at a missionary meeting in the city, and fell in love with you, rushed up and kissed you, so he says. Do you remember her? He is a favorite in the house, has served them faithfully for a number of years, and they were disposed to listen to his advice. He had heard me mentioned favorably by our firm more than once, and suggested that they send to inquire into the particulars of my leaving their employ. This was done, and Mr. Burton himself told the whole story, giving me an excellent name, Johns says, and admitting that he considered himself hasty in discharging me. Well, when McAllister and Hayes heard the story, they both, being members of the Sabbath Committee, and staunch advocates of a stricter observance of the day, agreed in 5 minutes to give me the vacancy, and sent Johns, who was coming down here for a 2 weeks' vacation, to interview me this morning, and tell me I might report at their establishment tomorrow morning, if I chose. "Tomorrow morning!" repeated Mrs. Spafford, with a little sinking at her heart despite the good news. Their first separation was then near at hand. "Yes, it is sudden, dear. But, after all, not too soon for me to go to work. An able-bodied man cannot sit down idly and let others feed him a minute longer than the providence of God seems to hold him there. You can come home in a little while, Callie. I can get all ready for you and the boy, and only think what a boy you will have to bring back. Besides, there is something else. You haven't asked me as to salary? What do you say to 1,000 a year, Robin Ruff?" and the foolishly happy father sang out the refrain of the old tune, stopped in the middle of a strain by a warning shake of his wife's head and a nestling in the crib. "Really, Warren?" "Really, Callie, with a prospect of increase if I succeed in meeting their requirements, which I can, for they have the name of being as fine a firm to work for as there is in the city." What do you think was Mrs. Spafford's second thought connected with this whole matter? She turned toward her husband, her soul shining in her eyes, her very voice radiant. "Oh, Warren, then we will have $100 a year for the jewel case. We had nothing for it this month, apparently, because you were earnestly trying to follow the Lord's own command. And now we have it almost doubled, and the influences can be traced back to the same cause. Isn't that wonderful?" "That reminds me, Callie, there is another point. I don't know what you will say to this. Johns wants to come out and board with us. He says he must get away from the city. Stuffy room he has, you know, and poor board, nothing home-like. I feel sorry for him. I told him we would consider the matter and let him know. I thought possibly you could see your way clear to giving him that extra room, and perhaps use his board to pay a girl with, and so get a little leisure yourself, as much as this fellow will give you. How does it strike you at first thought?" Mrs. Spafford's face clouded for a moment with a perplexed look, then cleared. "I had designs on that room," she said brightly. "I thought possibly we could make it do actual missionary work for us. But then who knows but this may be the Lord's appointed way for us to do it? This Mr. Johns isn't even a Christian, is he? Yet how do we know but he may be worth everything to the cause some day? Perhaps Mrs. Temple is right, and each little movement of ours tells, not only for the work at home, but for the great world abroad, if only our faith reaches out and grasps them all. Yes, Warren, I think we will make a home for him if he wishes. I feel as though I would like to make homes for everybody and take them all in. As for Mr. Johns, I have had a fancy for him ever since he waited so patiently while I changed my mind a dozen times about our carpet. We'll buy a pretty one for his room, won't we? Oh, see what the mail has brought me! A letter from our treasurer, with the largest remittance for my share in the business that I have ever had yet. That scheme is going to succeed royally. I feel it more than ever. Warren, I think I feel, just a little, as David did when he said, 'My cup runneth over.'" Now, passing over the long, quiet rest, when mother and child grew strong together, when Mrs. Spafford and her hostess grew daily more closely united in Christian love and sympathy, and took sweet counsel together, I shall let you peep into the little house deserted so suddenly on that summer morning, for this is the family reunion. All day long has the neighbor, Mrs. Evans, been moving with tireless feet about the rooms, giving them a home-like air. At supper time they were expected, and she has set the table in holiday array, in the bright dining room, and mindful of a certain supper table which marked a new era in her home life, and has made delicate little puffs of soda biscuit for supper, and stewed potatoes in milk, and broiled a steak, and she knows perfectly well, as she surveys all the nice appointments of the table, that Mrs. Spafford herself, pattern housekeeper though she may be, could not have improved upon the details of that meal. The expected ones have arrived, and are moving about upstairs at this moment, washing away the dust of travel. The Temple carriage brought them but a half hour ago, even as it had taken them away, but what a gay, bright, rollicking baby is returned to them in place of the wan shadow they carried away. "I shan't know him at all," had Mrs. Evans declared, to the satisfaction of the mother. She shivered even yet over the recollection of the pitiful little face he carried away. "How brown he is!" exclaimed the father, and the mother laughed, and declared that it was the sunshine on the sand, that he had done nothing for 6 weeks but roll around in the sand and shout and crow. Oh, yes, it had been a joyous homecoming. "We invited ourselves to supper," explained Mrs. Evans, as she seated the lady of the house and motioned her own husband to his place. "I knew you wouldn't be able to find things the first evening. I don't suppose I have them in the right place, but I know where they are, and that is all that is necessary at present. To-morrow, Mrs. Spafford, your Phyllis is to come. Don't you think, her name really is Phyllis? She knows how to do everything, so she says, and she looks as though she might know a good deal, especially about some things. I know I am glad she is to be your help, and not mine." Mr. Evans laid down his knife and fork to laugh. "My wife retains her horror of hired help in full force to this day," he said, with evident satisfaction. "You haven't had one around since Betty left you in the lurch that rainy morning, have you?" "Not for an hour," she said complacently, "and I confess it would give me a little twinge of disappointment to be obliged to have one. But you are mistaken, Dane, about the horror. I have lost all the old feeling of utter helplessness that used to come over me when I used to try to find fault without knowing wherein the fault lay or how to remedy it. It is a very different sensation to remember, if your help chooses to get offended and leave just at dinner time, that the dinner will not necessarily suffer in consequence. The trouble was, I was a slave to my ignorance until Mrs. Spafford gave me a taste of freedom." Upstairs, after the dining-room had been set in orderly array, the two ladies moved about, Mrs. Evans turning down the blankets of the pretty crib and making it ready for its occupant, and the mother, as she laid the happy boy within, and tucked the snowy coverings carefully, turned to her friend with a sweetly solemn smile on her face, as she said, "My friend, I have you also to thank for this hour. Under God, you saved my baby to me. I have never put into words how much I thank you for your swift, silent, thoughtful work, but God knows how I have remembered it, and always shall. I have lately come to feel what is to me a somewhat new idea about it. Who can tell what God may let those little hands, or that baby voice, do for his glory in the turning of the nations of the earth to himself? And if he gives him great things to do, will not part of the work be yours? What wonderful rewards God may have in store for even our smallest efforts made for his sake! I understand about the cup of cold water better than I ever did before." Mrs. Evans's eyes were moist as she answered humbly, "It is but a very little commonplace thing that I could do. I was just a simple errand girl, and carried a message to those who could and did. But my motive, I think, was love for you, my friend. I can claim no blessing from the Master." "Ah, can you not? Inasmuch as ye did it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, ye did it unto me." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Measuring Responsibility. "We must go home early tonight and give these people a chance to rest." This was what Mr. Evans said in one form or another several times during the earlier part of the evening, yet they lingered. Some absorbing topic of conversation would be immediately started by one of the circle, and the half movement to separate would be forestalled. The Evanses were so glad to get their neighbors back again, and the neighbors, on their part, were so gratefully glad to be back again, that it was hard to separate. Even when Mr. Evans actually arose and said, "Now really, Eva, we ought to go," Mrs. Spafford said just at that moment, "Oh, Mrs. Evans, I wanted to ask you about Jenny. Do you think she—" And here the ladies' chairs were drawn closer, and the tones became confidential. The two husbands looked at each other and smiled. Then something in Mr. Evans's face, a sort of wistful yet hesitating look, sent a telegraphic dispatch to the other gentleman's heart. They had been thrown much together, these two, during the weeks that had intervened since Mr. Spafford's return to the city, and he had tried to be a faithful witness for his lord. So now he laid a detaining hand on the other's arm, and said in a voice of grave yet winning inquiry, "My friend, is the great question settled yet?" Slowly and gravely Mr. Evans shook his head, yet he seemed relieved and grateful that the subject had been started, and Mr. Spafford, watching his face for a moment, ventured further. "I wish I knew just what is in the way. It has sometimes seemed to me, when I have been talking with you, as though you came up to a sort of stone wall which prevented you from taking another step. I wish I could know whether there is really an obstacle, and what it is. Perhaps we could together lift it out of the way." "There is an obstacle," declared Mr. Evans with an emphatic voice, after just a moment of irresolution. "You are right. I cannot take another step until an intervening question is decided." Meantime, Mrs. Spafford, who was deeply interested in the inquiries she was making, became suddenly aware that her friend's interest was elsewhere. The truth is, Mrs. Evans was in such a state of constant longing for her husband's decision on the momentous question, was so on the alert to have him influenced in the right direction, that the moment the question was presented, her heart seemed to take warning, and be ready to stand sentinel. Mrs. Spafford, following the direction of her eyes, saw her giving eager, almost painful heed to the conversation which was taking place over by the window. Therefore, both of the ladies heard Mr. Spafford's next question. "Is it anything that you are willing to tell me about?" "The fact is," said Mr. Evans, after another thoughtful pause, "I can't make a profession of one thing and live a life that is at variance with it. In other words, I can't continue in my present business and be a Christian. At least, it doesn't seem to me that I can. I have always regarded the temperance question as one of the most important with which a Christian had to do, and I have always been secretly ashamed of the Church because it did not take strong enough ground on this subject. Now, with my eyes as wide open as that, could I support my family from such a business, and at the same time claim myself as belonging to a master who, I believe, hates the whole thing?" "But, Mr. Evans, you have nothing to do with the selling of liquor." It was his wife's horrified voice that asked this question, or rather made this distressed statement. It was the first intimation her husband had that the conversation had become general. He turned toward her with a somewhat sad smile. The keener brain of the man had, years before, seen through the delicate film of respectability with which others had enshrouded his business, and which had satisfied his wife. "No, dear, but I buy it. That is, I pay for it, large sums of money every month, and make out bills of it, and deal with it in a dozen different ways. In fact, I have to do with the management of liquors as much as though I owned the entire establishment." "Well, but," urged his wife, distress still apparent in her voice, "you are only the clerk. You have no responsibility in the matter. It isn't your liquor, and you get no money for its sale. The responsibility of selling it doesn't belong to you." "My dear wife, I might say the same thing if I were a clerk for old Green, down here at the corner, and sold bad whiskey at so much a glass. You see, there is no such thing as shirking responsibilities in that way. I get my living from the sale of that which I believe to be a curse to the world, and whether I pour it into a glass or count the money that is paid for it, seems to me to have very little to do with the real question. To be sure, I can say, if I don't receive the salary, somebody else will, and I might as well have it as anybody. But the trouble with that argument is, It proves too much. A thief can use it. There are always people enough to steal, and I might as well share the plunder as anyone. How would you like that reasoning, Eva?" She smiled a wan sort of smile. She understood the illustration, and could not help seeing that the cases were sufficiently analogous to have it fit. Still, the idea was new to her, and hateful. "I have never thought of such a thing," she said, drawing a long breath. "If it has seemed so to you, Dane, I wonder that you have borne it so long." "Yes," he said, his face darkening, and he arose and began to walk up and down the room. "That is just the difference between Spafford here and myself. He sees things and does them, and I see things and shirk them, and one can't be a Christian and do that last, in my opinion. So there I am. Don't you see, Spafford, I haven't a chance to take any steps?" "No," said Mr. Spafford emphatically, "I don't see anything of the kind. If your reasoning is clear, you have a very serious step to take." "Aye, that's the trouble, too serious. You see, it is all we have to depend upon, my wife and I. For a long time I settled down upon the thought that it was a man's duty to take care of his family, and that I must not give up my situation until I secured another, and I have been secretly at work for months trying to find an opening. But there isn't any such thing as an opening. Apparently I am shut up to this one place. I haven't heard of even a possible chance for something in the future. I told myself that it was plainly my duty to hold on here, that it was equally my duty not to make a public profession while I was so engaged, and I've been trying, if ever a man did, to live two lives. I have tried hard to act like a Christian and feel like a Christian, and I can't do it. I feel more like a hypocrite than anything else. Still, it wasn't very plain to me what I ought to do until your trial hour came, Spafford, and with less to live on than I have, and more at stake, you swung off on what looked like a very little matter, too. I heard a member of the same church as yourself criticize you sharply, classing your line of conduct as belonging to those who strain at a gnat and swallow a camel, though he omitted to say what camel you had swallowed. Well, it opened my eyes, as soon at least as I would allow myself to open them. I called you a fool for a few days, but I knew all the time that you were simply an honest man with a live conscience. By the same sign I knew that I wasn't. I see plainly now what I ought to do, but I haven't advanced an inch. I shrink from it as hard as ever. How can I deliberately relinquish our only chance of support and fold my hands? Spafford, do you see how I can do it? Now tell me, what would you advise?" "What does Mrs. Evans advise?" It was Mr. Spafford who asked this question, whereupon her husband turned toward her a distressed look. It was evident that he did not expect his wife to understand or appreciate the awful straits to which he was reduced. She was a temperance woman in a sweet and quiet way, but she had never been what her uncle had called a temperance fanatic, and the definitions of society had heretofore given her complete, unquestioning satisfaction. How could she be expected to see what the light of God's own Spirit had made plain to his keener mind? It was evident that her husband shrank from the ordeal presented to him for his wife's sake. During these last 2 years she had grown peculiarly, inexpressibly dear to him. They had been years of rest in his home. What he had supposed was a quiet little spirit had suddenly, 2 years before, arisen and asserted its freedom from domestic thraldom. She would have no more of the so-called help that she had hitherto endured about her. She would be her own mistress, and do her own work. Her husband had laughed sarcastically, and looked on moodily, but the resolute housekeeper had held steadily on her way. She spent long hours in the Spafford kitchen, concocting mysteries which blossomed into results on their own table. She steadily held her own one evening against first ridicule and then positive annoyance, until she literally made her husband say just what sum he thought they could safely spare for the week's household expenses. His reluctance to tell her, arising from the fact that he knew much better than she did how alarmingly small it was in comparison with what they had been using. But she received the figures meekly enough, and set about apportioning them after the fashion that she had learned from Mrs. Spafford, and neither then nor afterward did she call for a larger sum. On the contrary, she steadily saved from the week's allowance, until one evening she amazed her husband by producing enough to pay a certain bill, which had chafed his nerves and driven sleep from his pillow for hours together. It was not until after that event that Mr. Evans actually opened his eyes wide to see that a thorough domestic reform had been inaugurated in his home, and that the wheels were running smoothly. Since which time he had been sure of one thing, that his wife was a woman of rare wisdom and skill and tact as regarded the management of a home. Great comfort had they enjoyed in their home during these 2 years. A little box of a place it was still, but as pretty a home as one need care to see, and every night when he hastened to it, Dane Evans realized that the genius who presided within grew dearer. Yet by so much more did he want to shield her from outside winds. She had learned to use the means he brought, to make a very restful Eden of the home. Could he expect her to think it would be either wise or right to withdraw all the visible means for sustaining it? Make beggars of themselves, indeed. It was hardly fair to appeal to her for advice, yet Mr. Spafford had done it. At the mention of her name, Mrs. Evans arose from her seat. Her eyes were bright, her cheeks were glowing. She went over to her husband, and clasping both her hands over his arm, in a fashion she had when they were alone, and she was very much in earnest, she spoke exactly as though she had forgotten, as indeed she had, that there were any others present. "Oh, Dane, how is it possible that you can hesitate one moment? I have prayed and prayed, and cried before God, begging him to bring you to a decision. I knew he was calling you. I could not think what stood in your way. I am not wise about these matters, you know, Dane, and I never thought of this. I cannot tell you how glad, how very glad and grateful I am that it is not my miserable, inconsistent life as a Christian that was holding you back. I know you had a very high ideal, and I knew I fell so far short. But Dane, don't, oh, I beg of you, don't for one moment let the thought of how we shall live keep you from giving yourself to Christ. He will take care that we do not starve, unless he wants us to starve for his sake. And I'm sure that would be no harder than many other things. We can't do just as he wishes, Dane, you and I, but don't let us for one moment go contrary to his plain directions. If he has told you that the way we get our money is wrong, don't let us have another cent of it." Long before these eager, impassioned sentences were concluded, Mr. Evans had put his arm around his wife, and drawn her closely to him, and the tears were dropping from his eyes. Mr. Spafford, also, had drawn his handkerchief, and was clearing his throat in a suspicious manner. As for his wife, her eyes were too bright for tears. She had been confident that her quiet and gentle friend had depths of feeling and heights of self-renunciation that were not suspected, even by her husband. It was just as well for him to discover what a power he had beside him. Mr. Spafford arose, and went over to where the husband and wife stood. "Swing off, Evans," he said, earnestly. "There is no peace short of that. I have discovered, by my own experiences, that the Lord will have nothing to do with compromises. When he has made the right entirely plain to you, the manner in which you may be sustained, while you are treading the road of his pointing out, is in a sense not your concern. He will undertake it for you. Trust him." I don't know how to trust," said Mr. Evans tremulously. "I would like to feel trustful, but I certainly don't." "Faith is the gift of God," quoted Mrs. Spafford in clear, ringing voice. It was the first time she had spoken. "Yes," said her husband, "that is one of the heart troubles which may be taken to him too. The question just now is, do you intend to accept him as your leader? Are you ready to resign your will to his, and walk in the paths of his pointing out, and no other? Evans, what you want is an effort of the will. You have been trying to do your own planning, to see your way perfectly clear, and when you had succeeded in arranging everything to your satisfaction, you were going to tell the Lord that you were willing now to serve him. I don't believe he would ever have opened a way for such service. What he wants is your absolute surrender into his hands." "I don't believe I understand you, Spafford. I dare say I am dull, but these things are all new to me. Now, I might be really anxious to trust my affairs in your hands, but if my brain would keep working over them, trying to plan, I hardly see how I would be to blame, or how I could stop planning. I might resolve with all my might to stop, but the planning, I fancy, would still go on, almost in spite of me." "Let me take your own illustration, my friend, and complete it. Suppose me to be so powerful a friend that your judgment justified you in placing all your affairs in my hands, and your mind said, 'I will follow his directions in every particular. When any plan is suggested to my mind, I will take it at once to him, and whether his ways seem to me wise or not, I will follow them.' If that was the deliberate language of your heart, it would really, in one sense, make little difference how much planning you did. Don't you see, my friend, that your next step is to surrender your independence to the Lord, willing yourself to obey him?" Then there was silence in that little parlor while one of those deliberations was taking place, such as the angels watch over with intense interest. What would the issue be? Mr. Spafford silently pushed a chair forward, and Mr. Evans, rousing for a moment, placed his wife in it, drew a seat beside her, and sat down, his face shaded by his hand, himself evidently in deep and troubled thought. "There is one thing," said Mr. Spafford, suddenly breaking the silence, "that perhaps is hardly necessary to say, yet some way I feel like saying it. I know, by experience you remember, that the way looks somewhat dark when there is no apparent means of support, yet no one certainly knows better than I do, than we do, how promptly friends start up for hours of need. So I wanted to remind you that so long as Callie and I have a home and bread, we are more than ready to share them with you until such time as your way shines clear." Mr. Evans reached forth his hand and grasped that of his friend. "God bless you," he said. "You are a true friend to me. I realize the actual disgrace I am to God for being unable to trust my affairs with him. I don't feel an atom of trust. The way looks as dark as Egypt. But I plainly see what would be the right thing to do, and as you say, I can control my will, if I cannot my heart, and I will obey his directions so far as I can see them from this time forth. So help me God." "Amen," said Mrs. Spafford. "Let us pray." In a moment the little circle were on their knees, and the parlor, so often consecrated by the voice of prayer, was filled once more with words of consecration and thanksgiving. Directly Mr. Spafford's voice ceased, his wife took up the petition, and then Mrs. Evans, her voice so tremulous from pent-up emotion that she could hardly syllable the words, breathed forth the hopes and desires and longings of her heart. Then a moment of silence, and a new voice was chronicled in heaven as among the list of those of whom it was said, "Behold, he prayeth." As they arose from their knees, Mr. Evans held out his hand again to his friend. "It is very strange," he said, smiling, There is certainly nothing in my outward circumstances in any wise altered from what it was 20 minutes ago, but the heaviness of spirit is gone. I feel now as though I could trust him not only, but as though it were a pleasure to do so. May he bless you for what you have been to me. I don't believe I should ever have seen my duty in this matter, but for the step which you took in the dark for the honor of his name. And now we really must say good night, or rather good morning. I don't feel as though there were any night. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24, Measured in Prose. During the 2 years' break in our story, another home had been established. At least, they called it a home. It was in an upper story of one of those semi-genteel boarding-houses which abound in large cities. 3 flights of stairs, a long passage down a dimly lighted hall, smelling of old carpeting, and you will reach the door of this home. A fair-sized room, carpeted in dingy colors, a once good Brussels of the exasperating kind which never wears into honest holes, justifying one in selling it to the ragman, but simply grows duller, grows threadbare, grows gloomy. Walls hung with large-figured dark paper to match the carpet, having grown old along with it. Curtains heavy and dark and gloomy-looking, grown old too, like the dreary-faced keeper of this dreary boarding-house. A haircloth sofa, several haircloth chairs, one brisk little new-fashioned rocker in bright colors, an old-fashioned sofa bedstead, dark, solid wood, looking respectable but gloomy, and speaking, like the carpet and the curtains, of other days. Marble-topped dressing-bureau and wash-stand, the woodwork of which was sadly marred, this compromised the general furnishing of the room. To be sure, there were little home touches, tidies on the sofa and chairs, lace-trimmed pillow-shams and bolster-shams, knick-knacks of one sort or another on the high, old-fashioned mantel. All of these had a careless look, as though the owner had grown weary of keeping them in the daintiness of perfect order. Yet this one room, up 3 flights of stairs, is the spot where those 2 people, who went to the opera together on a never-to-be-forgotten evening long ago, are living out together the prose of that life which began in poetry during their homeward ride. More than a year had Will Coleman and his wife spent in this room. They were together in it now, Jenny in careful costume, for they had just come up from dinner, which was served at a fashionable hour in a fashionable dreary basement dining-room, with certain fashionable surroundings in the shape of handsome old dishes and a few solid silver pieces, and when you had said this, you had said all that was to be commended about the meals served there. Still, because of the silver pieces, and the once fine furniture, and the faded Brussels carpets, and the general air of decayed respectability, a large sum, viewed in comparison with their income, had to be paid. The question of income was a sore one to Jenny Coleman, even as it had always been an important one to Jenny West. The history of the last year of her life might be summed up in one sentence: a dreary effort to be what she was not, and to do what she could not. Her forehead was drawn in habitual wrinkles, a soured, discontented look was growing on her face, and in short, she looked as she sat there, reading the announcements of the evening amusements, as unlike the pretty girl whom Will Coleman had escorted to the opera 2 years before as can be imagined. She threw the paper aside presently, the wrinkles deepening on her forehead, and opened the conversation with a pettish exclamation. "I wish we could ever go anywhere." "What now?" It was Will Coleman who asked this short, not to say crabbed, question. He, too, had changed in the space of 2 years. He was growing older, there was no mistaking it. Gray touches were being given to his hair. Also, he was growing fleshy and red-faced. I find it very difficult to put the change into words. It is one thing to talk about a few gray hairs, and a few added pounds of flesh, and a florid look on the face, and quite another thing to sit and look at a familiar form, which was, only a short time ago, a very embodiment of alert, sprightly gentlemanliness, and realize the distinctly seen, yet indescribable change which marks him as an unsatisfied, unsuccessful, almost middle-aged man. I don't think Jenny Coleman saw this, in full force at least, but she knew him to be in many respects unlike the Will Coleman who had made a heaven for her out of that homeward ride in the moonlight. If the echo of the tenderness that was in his voice that evening could have reached to her tonight, as he said sharply, "What now?" the contrast might have brought the tears. But the truth was, her heart was not busy with retrospect. "Oh, nothing new," she said, the petulance in her voice being even more distinctly marked. "I was just looking over all the things that were going on tonight, and thinking how we sat here cooped up in this den, not able to go anywhere or do anything. Night after night the same thing, and the same old story of not being able to afford it dinging in my ears. I'm tired of it." "We have to pay enough for the den. We might have a degree of respect for it on that account. I've always observed that things which cost a great deal fill you with admiration. I don't see why you can't go to work and admire this establishment on the strength of that." "Oh, now, Will, don't try to be witty. You never were intended for distinction in that line. I don't know when you have had occasion to observe anything of the kind. It is very certain that I don't have a chance to prove my admiration by making any purchases in these days. I'm always ashamed to go shopping with any of the ladies in the house. I am the only one among them who never has any money to spend." "No, that's a great trouble of yours. You never have any money to spend, because you can't keep any until you need to spend it. Somebody spends a good deal more than I can earn, you know. I wonder who it is. Not this chap, anyhow. I've practiced economy to a degree that I never imagined possible in my bachelor days." "Oh, yes, you are a pattern of economy." The tone was so severely mocking that Will Coleman, albeit he had provoked it by his own rudeness, was startled, and looked over the paper he was pretending to read, studying his wife with a curious sense of wonder that one whom he used to know as Jenny West could use such words and such an accent. One great difficulty with the poor young husband was, that though he distinctly saw the change in her, he did not realize a corresponding one in himself. The cruel, mocking tones went on. "You never buy ices or fruits or dainty little lunches, or indulge in soothing trips up the lake at 50 cents an hour. If I were you, I wouldn't talk about economy. I was always considered an economist before I was married, but I wasn't in a perpetual state of beggarliness as I am nowadays." Now the truth was that Will Coleman, in the days of his bachelorhood, had been so accustomed to indulging in these which he was pleased to call trifling expenditures, that the habits were upon him, and during the earlier months of his married life he had continued them thoughtlessly, though rarely without bringing his wife something which he called an equivalent, in the shape of fruits or bonbons. Very soon, however, he discovered that all these things were really alarming leaks, and he was struggling manfully, if one can apply the word to so childish a habit, to avoid all unnecessary expenses. It is true that his definition of the term unnecessary needed correcting, but all the same he considered himself a slandered man, and his face flushed painfully during the earlier part of the sentence. But by the time Jenny had announced herself as having been considered an economist in the days of her maidenhood, He was ready to laugh. No one knew better than he how persistently all her loose change had lost itself in the vortex of ribbons, laces, gloves, and the like. The consciousness that she was really saying a foolish thing made Mrs. Coleman sensitive to her husband's laugh, and in no way softened her voice. "Oh, yes, you laugh, of course. That is your favorite method of treating your wife's views and opinions. But I can assure you that I never dreamed of having to twist and turn through life in this way. If I had, I should have considered long before I put myself in such a position." "You ought to have married a rich man." Her husband's voice was controlled, and she did not realize how her words had stung him. "I wish to goodness I had," she declared, driven to desperation by his apparent indifference. "Amen," he replied promptly and with emphasis. Then he turned the page of his paper and apparently went on with the business of reading the news. As for Jenny, she sat looking out of the window down the rows of tall chimneys which shut out all other view. Her heart was swelling with indignation. She considered herself an ill-used woman. This conversation, miserable though it was, is actually a fair specimen of the sort of talk in which these two often indulged. Do you suppose that either of them imagined the possibility of such a climax to that heavenly ride home from the opera? What an awful fact it is to have to record that there were times in which this husband and wife actually wished that the results which followed that evening's pleasure had never been. Not that they by any means hated each other, or indeed were entirely indifferent to each other, but the realities of married life had been too much for them, as they will be for all who do not start from a rock foundation. It is a painful thing to admit, but scenes like the one through which she had just passed were really too common to weigh with lengthened heaviness on Jenny Coleman, or make her long silent when she had an item of importance to communicate. So she presently broke the stillness with a question. "What do you suppose Dane Evans has done now?" "It is entirely beyond me to guess. Something unparalleled in folly, to judge from your tone." "He will be likely to consider it folly before he gets through with it." This sentence not whetting her husband's curiosity sufficiently to call forth a question, she continued. "Have you seen him today? Perhaps you know the whole story?" "Haven't seen him in 3 weeks. He and Spafford have so much in common nowadays that he has no time for me." "Well, he has thrown up his situation." "What?" "Yes, he has. Mrs. Peterson told me at lunch. And her husband is in the same office, you know, and heard all about it." "What has he done it for?" "For a piece of folly or sentimentality. Dane always was sentimental in streaks. He never would have married Eva if he hadn't been." "What is he going to do?" "Nothing. Live on his conscience, I suppose. He professes it as a conscientious movement. I should think it had taken his conscience a long time to enlighten him. He has been there nearly 10 years. "Mrs. Coleman, enlighten me. What has conscience to do with Evans's clerkship? They haven't been requiring Sunday work, have they? And if they did, it wouldn't be any worse than Sunday lounging or Sunday riding, I should think. He has done enough of both. To be sure, though, he may have been taken with a desire to copy Spafford." "That is just what it is. He is trying to copy Mr. Spafford, and Callie sets him a copy which he dutifully follows. Now she is enlarging her circle and taking Dane and Eva completely under her control." "You haven't enlightened me yet as to what it is all about." "Why, can't you see?" with a strong flavor of impatience in her voice. "Your conscience is certainly not tender on the subject. He has decided that to be a clerk in a liquor dealing establishment is a sin. Therefore he has thrown up his situation and is going to live on public charity, or church charity. I hear he is going to unite with the church next Sunday. I suppose they'll support him and call him a martyr for a few weeks, until they get tired of him, then they will throw him off, and he may go to the poorhouse for all they will care. I must say I'm sorry for Eva. Papa never thought Dane Evans would amount to much, and it seems he wasn't mistaken." "Do you really mean that Evans has given up there, with no other opportunity opening, and no knowledge of what he will do next? And there hasn't been any quarrel or dissatisfaction or anything of that sort?" "Yes, he has done just that. Mrs. Peterson said the firm argued with him, expressed their entire satisfaction, asked if he had other prospects, and hinted pretty plainly that if it was a question of salary, they were ready to do as well by him as any other firm. But he boldly declared he could not stay if they doubled his salary, that money had nothing to do with it. He had no place in view, no prospects. It was purely a question of principle. Said he had been thinking the matter over for a long time, but had only recently come to a definite conclusion. That means since Callie Spafford came home. She is such a born fanatic herself that she cannot rest easy on her pillow until she sees someone preparing to become as wild a lunatic as herself." Will Coleman's paper had dropped to the floor, and his eyes were gazing into vacancy in a thoughtful way. Whether he had heard the last few sentences did not appear, but what he said was entirely foreign to their tenor. "I must say that is astounding. Dane Evans is more of a man than I had the least idea of." Now there was that in this sentence which irritated Mrs. Coleman almost beyond control. She could not herself have defined what it was, at least she would not have liked to do so, but she answered, with increasing asperity, "Indeed, your penetration is entirely beyond me. I fail to see the slightest evidence of manhood or even common sense in such an idiotic proceeding as this. It may be a cause for admiration to see a man deliberately shirk his only means for supporting a wife and hide behind an affectation of principle, but as I said, I fail to see it in that light. However, my eyes are getting opened. You gentlemen who have always been such ardent admirers of Callie Spafford stand ready to follow her lead without regard to common sense. I shall expect next to be informed that your conscience won't allow you to sell eggs and butter and cheese for Mr. Prime any more, because his other branch store sells tobacco and cider vinegar." Her husband laughed, and stooped down and picked up his paper. If his wife had not been too much excited to observe it, she would have felt that his laugh was exceedingly unpleasant in its tone. So was his voice. "Don't you be afraid of any such catastrophe. I have been tutored by a very different feminine from your friend Mrs. Spafford. I know better than to indulge in any such expensive principles. At the same time, I am not so reduced but that I can admire high-toned actions in another, and I say Dane Evans is more of a man than I had the least idea of. If I were rich, I'd see to it that he didn't suffer for his convictions, and his determination to carry them out. As it is, I can only admire at a distance. I have no hopes of ever emulating. Meantime, I have an item of news to communicate. Evans isn't the only man who has planned a change of base. I've given up my clerkship. No more butter and eggs to sell. So you see you needn't fear my being demoralized about the tobacco and cider." His wife turned entirely away from the window, and gazed at her husband with a half-frightened, half-incredulous air. She did not know what she feared. It could not be that any such scruples as Dane Evans had yielded to could have crossed his path. So far as she knew, there was no opportunity in his work for conscientious scruples. And also, if there had been, she had lost her former idea of him. She never quoted him in her thoughts any more as a perfect Christian gentleman. She waited a moment, then said, "Well, why don't you explain? What do you mean?" "Wasn't my meaning plain? I said I had given up my clerkship." "And what do you mean to do now? Starve in company with my half-witted cousins?" "No, I never expect to starve in such good company. Evans has gotten ahead of me somehow. A few years ago I used to be quoted as immensely beyond him spiritually, whatever that may mean." And the sentence ended with that disagreeable laugh. His wife was growing alarmed. "Mr. Coleman," she said haughtily, "if you can manage to be serious long enough to tell me what you are talking about, I should be glad. You certainly appear very strange to-night." "Do I? That is because I have made such a violent effort to give you pleasure to-day, and I am succeeding so well. I have taken a leap into respectability such as once I had no idea of. I'm Fargo, Belmont and Company's confidential clerk. Salary $2,000 a year. You can hunt a new boarding place and get a $40 bonnet and 3 pairs of 10-button kids as soon as you please." "Who are Fargo, Belmont and Company?" "Wholesale liquor dealers, the most extensive firm in the city. Oh, it is eminently respectable. They never sell less than a barrel of it at a time." "But, Will, you will not have to sell liquor?" The evident dismay in her tone seemed to amuse him. "No," he said, with a burst of laughter. "Oh, no, not at all. I only keep a sharp lookout that other people buy plenty of it, and pay for it." Chapter 25